The Coming of Arthur, from Le Morte d'Arthur and the Mabinogion, by Beatrice Clay. Chapter 1. Of Arthur's Birth and How He Became King. Long years ago there ruled over Britain a king called Uther Pendragon. A mighty prince was he, and feared by all men. Yet, when he sought the love of the fair Igraine of Cornwall, she would have naught to do with him, so that from grief and disappointment Uther fell sick, and at last seemed like to die. Now in those days there lived a famous magician named Merlin, so powerful that he could change his form at will, or even make himself invisible, nor was there any place so remote but that he could reach it at once, merely by wishing himself there. One day, suddenly, he stood at Uther's bedside and said, "Sir King, I know thy grief, and am ready to help thee. Only promise to give me, at his birth, the son that shall be born to thee, and thou shalt have thy heart's desire." To this the king agreed joyfully, and Merlin kept his word, for he gave Uther the form of one whom Igraine had loved dearly, and so she took him willingly for her husband. When the time had come that a child should be born to the king and queen, Merlin appeared before Uther to remind him of his promise, and Uther swore it should be as he had said. 3 days later, a prince was born, and with pomp and ceremony was christened by the name of Arthur. But immediately thereafter, the king commanded that the child should be carried to the postern gate, there to be given to the old man who would be found waiting without. Not long after, Uther fell sick, and he knew that his end was come. So, by Merlin's advice, he called together his knights and barons, and said to them, "My death draws near. I charge you, therefore, that ye obey my son, even as ye have obeyed me, and my curse upon him if he claim not the crown when he is a man grown." Then the king turned his face to the wall and died. Scarcely was Uther laid in his grave before disputes arose. Few of the nobles had seen Arthur or even heard of him, and not one of them would have been willing to be ruled by a child. Rather, each thought himself fitted to be king, and strengthening his own castle, made war on his neighbors until confusion alone was supreme. And the poor groaned because there was none to help them. Now when Merlin carried away Arthur, for Merlin was the old man who had stood at the postern gate, he had known all that would happen, and had taken the child to keep him safe from the fierce barons until he should be of age to rule wisely and well, and perform all the wonders prophesied of him. He gave the child to the care of the good knight Sir Ector to bring up with his son Kay, but revealed not to him that it was the son of Uther Pendragon that was given into his charge. At last, when years had passed and Arthur was grown a tall youth, well skilled in knightly exercises, Merlin went to the Archbishop of Canterbury and advised him that he should call together at Christmas time all the chief men of the realm at the great cathedral in London. "For," said Merlin, "there shall be seen a great marvel, by which it shall be made clear to all men who is the lawful king of this land." The Archbishop did as Merlin counselled. Under pain of a fearful curse, he bade barons and knights come to London to keep the feast and to pray heaven to send peace to the realm. The people hastened to obey the Archbishop's commands, and from all sides barons and knights came riding in to keep the birth feast of our Lord. And when they had prayed and were coming forth from the cathedral, they saw a strange sight. There, in the open space before the church, stood on a great stone an anvil thrust through with a sword, and on the stone were written these words: "Whoso can draw forth this sword is rightful king of Britain born." At once there were fierce quarrels, each man clambering to be the first to try his fortune, none doubting his own success. Then the Archbishop decreed that each should make the venture in turn, from the greatest baron to the least knight, and each in turn, having put forth his utmost strength, failed to move the sword 1 inch, and drew back ashamed. So the Archbishop dismissed the company, and having appointed guards to watch over the stone, sent messengers through all the land to give word of great jousts to be held in London at Easter, when each knight could give proof of his skill and courage, and try whether the adventure of the sword was for him. Among those who rode to London at Easter was the good Sir Ector, and with him his son Sir Kay, newly made a knight, and the young Arthur. When the morning came that the joust should begin, Sir Kay and Arthur mounted their horses and set out for the lists. But before they reached the field, Kay looked and saw that he had left his sword behind. Immediately Arthur turned back to fetch it for him, only to find the house fast shut, for all were gone to view the tournament. Sore vexed was Arthur, fearing lest his brother Kay should lose his chance of gaining glory, till of a sudden he bethought him of the sword in the great anvil before the cathedral. Thither he rode with all speed, and the guards having deserted their post to view the tournament, there was none to forbid him the adventure. He leaped from his horse, seized the hilt, and instantly drew forth the sword as easily as from a scabbard. Then, mounting his horse and thinking no marvel of what he had done, he rode after his brother and handed him the weapon. When Kay looked at it, he saw at once that it was the wondrous sword from the stone. In great joy he sought his father, and showing it to him, said, "Then must I be King of Britain." But Sir Ector bade him say how he came by the sword, and when Sir Kay told how Arthur had brought it to him, Sir Ector bent his knee to the boy and said, "Sir, I perceive that ye are my king, and here I tender you my homage." And Kay did as his father. Then the three sought the archbishop, to whom they related all that had happened, and he, much marvelling, called the people together to the great stone, and bade Arthur thrust back the sword, and draw it forth again in the presence of all, which he did with ease. But an angry murmur arose from the barons, who cried that what a boy could do, a man could do. So, at the archbishop's word, the sword was put back, and each man, whether baron or knight, tried in his turn to draw it forth, and failed. Then for the third time Arthur drew forth the sword. Immediately there arose from the people a great shout, "Arthur is king! Arthur is king! We will have no king but Arthur!" And though the great barons scowled and threatened, they fell on their knees before him, while the archbishop placed the crown upon his head, and swore to obey him faithfully as their lord and sovereign. Thus Arthur was made king, and to all he did justice, righting wrongs and giving to all their dues. Nor was he forgetful of those that had been his friends, for Kay, whom he loved as a brother, he made seneschal and chief of his household, and to Sir Ector, his foster-father, he gave broad lands. Chapter 2. The Round Table. Thus Arthur was made king, but he had to fight for his own, for 11 great kings drew together and refused to acknowledge him as their lord, and chief amongst the rebels was King Lot of Orkney, who had married Arthur's sister, Bellicent. By Merlin's advice, Arthur sent for help overseas to Ban and Bors, the 2 great kings who ruled in Gaul. With their aid, he overthrew his foes in a great battle near the river Trent, and then he passed with them into their own lands and helped them drive out their enemies. So there was ever great friendship between Arthur and the kings Ban and Bors and all their kindred, and afterwards some of the most famous knights of the Round Table were of that kin. Then King Arthur set himself to restore order throughout his kingdom. To all who would submit and amend their evil ways, he showed kindness. But those who persisted in oppression and wrong he removed, putting in their places others who would deal justly with the people. And because the land had become overrun with forest during the days of misrule, he cut roads through the thickets, that no longer wild beasts and men, fiercer than beasts, should lurk in their gloom, to the harm of the weak and defenseless. Thus it came to pass that soon the peasant plowed his fields in safety, and where had been wastes, men dwelt again in peace and prosperity. Among the lesser kings whom Arthur helped to rebuild their towns and restore order was King Leodegrance of Cameliard. Now, Leodegrance had one fair child, his daughter Guinevere. And from the time that first he saw her, Arthur gave her all his love. So he sought counsel of Merlin, his chief adviser. Merlin heard the king sorrowfully, and he said, Sir King, when a man's heart is set, he may not change. Yet had it been well if ye had loved another. So the king sent his knights to Leodegrance to ask of him his daughter, and Leodegrance consented, rejoicing to wed her to so good and knightly a king. With great pomp the princess was conducted to Canterbury, and there the king met her, and they two were wed by the archbishop in the great cathedral amid the rejoicings of the people. On that same day did Arthur found his Order of the Round Table, the fame of which was to spread throughout Christendom and endure through all time. Now the Round Table had been made for King Uther Pendragon by Merlin, who had meant thereby to set forth plainly to all men the roundness of the earth. After Uther died, King Leodegrance had possessed it, but when Arthur was wed, he sent it to him as a gift, and great was the king's joy at receiving it. 150 knights might take their places about it, and for them Merlin made sieges or seats. 128 did Arthur knight at that great feast. Thereafter, if any sieges were empty, at the high festival of Pentecost, new knights were ordained to fill them, and by magic was the name of each knight found inscribed in letters of gold in his proper siege. One seat only long remained unoccupied, and that was the siege Perilous. No knight might occupy it until the coming of Sir Galahad, for without danger to his life, none might sit there who was not free from all stain of sin. With pomp and ceremony did each knight take upon him the vows of true knighthood, to obey the king, to show mercy to all who asked it, to defend the weak, and for no worldly gain to fight in a wrongful cause. And all the knights rejoiced together, doing honor to Arthur and to his queen. Then they rode forth to right the wrong and help the oppressed, and by their aid the king held his realm in peace, doing justice to all. Chapter 3. Of the Finding of Excalibur. Now when Arthur was first made king, as young knights will, he courted peril for its own sake, and often would he ride unattended by lonely forest ways, seeking the adventure that chance might send him. All unmindful was he of the ruin to his realm if mischief befell him, and even his trusty counsellors, though they grieved that he should thus imperil him, yet could not but love him the more for his hardihood. So on a day he rode through the forest Perilous, where dwelt the lady Anor, a sorceress of great might, who used her magic powers but for the furtherance of her own desires. And as she looked from a turret window, she descried King Arthur come riding down a forest glade, and the sunbeams falling upon him made one glory of his armor and of his yellow hair. Then, as Anor gazed upon the king, her heart grew hot within her, and she resolved that, come what might, she would have him for her own, to dwell with her always, and fulfill all her behests. And so she bade lower the drawbridge, and raise the portcullis, and sallying forth, accompanied by her maidens, she gave King Arthur courteous salutation, and prayed him that he would rest within her castle that day, for that she had made a petition to make to him, and Arthur, doubting nothing of her good fate, suffered himself to be led within. Then was a great feast spread, and Anor caused the king to be seated in a chair of state at her right hand, while squires and pages served him on bended knee. So when they had feasted, the king turned to the lady Anor, and said courteously, Lady, somewhat yet said of a request that ye should make. If there be aught in which I may pleasure you, I pray you let me know it, and I will serve you as knightly as I may. In truth, said the lady, there is that which I could faint entreat of you, most noble knight. Yet suffer, I beseech you, that first I may show you somewhat of my castle and my estate, and then will I crave a boon of your chivalry. Then the sorceress led King Arthur from room to room of her castle, and ever each displayed greater store of beauty than the last. In some the walls were hung with rich tapestries, in others they gleamed with precious stones, and the king marvelled what might be the petition of one that was mistress of such wealth. Lastly, Anur brought the king out upon the battlements, and as he gazed around him, he saw that since he had entered the castle, there had sprung up about it triple walls of defence that shut out wholly the forest from view. Then turned he to Anur, and gravely he said, Lady, greatly I marvel in what a simple knight may pleasure one that is mistress of so wondrous a castle as ye have shown me here. Yet, if there be aught in which I may render you knightly service, right gladly would I hear it now, for I must forth upon my way to render service to those whose knight I am sworn. Nay, now, King Arthur, answered the sorceress mockingly, ye may not think to deceive me, for well I know you, and that all Britain bows to your behest. The more reason then that I should ride forth to right wrong, and succour them that, of their royalty, render true obedience to their lord. Ye speak as a fool, said the sorceress. Why should one that may command be at the beck and call of every hind and slave within his realm? Nay, rest thee here with me, and I will make thee ruler of a richer land than Britain, and give thee to satisfy thy every desire. Lady, said the king sternly, I will hear and judge of your petition at this time, and then will I forth upon my way. Nay, said Anur, there needs not this harshness. I did but speak for thine advantage. Only vow thee to my service, and there is not art thou canst desire that thou shalt not possess. Thou shalt be lord of this fair castle, and of the mighty powers that obey me. Why waste thy youth in hardship, and in the service of such as shall render thee little enough again? Thereupon, without ever a word, the king turned him about and made for the turret stair by which he had ascended, but nowhere could he find it. Then said the sorceress, mocking him, Fair sir, how think ye to escape without my good will? See ye not the walls that guard my stronghold? And think ye that I have not servants enow to do my bidding? She clapped her hands, and forthwith there appeared a company of squires, who, at her command, seized the king and bore him away to a strong chamber, where they locked him in. And so the king abode that night, the prisoner of that evil sorceress, with little hope that day, when it dawned, should bring him better cheer. Yet lost he not courage, but kept watch and vigil the night through, lest the powers of evil should assail him unawares. And with the early morning light, Anur came to visit him. More stately she seemed than the night before, more tall and more terrible, and her dress was one blaze of flashing gems, so that scarce could the eye look upon her. As a queen might address a vassal, so greeted she the king, and as condescending to one of low estate, asked how he had fared that night. And the king made answer, I have kept vigil as behoves a knight, who knowing him to be in the midst of danger, would bear himself meetly in any peril that should offer. And the lady Anur, admiring his knightly courage, desired more earnestly even than before to win him to her will, and she said, Sir Arthur, I know well your courage and knightly fame, and greatly do I desire to keep you with me. Stay with me, and I promise you that you shall bear sway over a wider realm than any that ever ye heard of, and I, even I, its mistress, will be at your command. And what lose ye if ye accept my offer? Little enough, I ween, for never think that ye shall win the world from evil, and men to loyalty and truth. Then answered the king in anger, Full well I see that thou art in league with evil, and that thou but seekest to turn me from my purpose. I defy thee, foul sorceress. Do thy worst. Thou shalt slay me, thou shalt never sway me to thy will. And therewith the king raised his cross-hilted sword before her. Then the lady quailed at the sight. Her heart was filled with hate, but she said, Go your way, proud king of a petty realm. Rule well your race of miserable mortals, since more it pleasures you than to bear sway over the powers of the air. I keep you not against your will. With these words she passed from the chamber, And the king heard her give command to her squires to set him without her gates, give him his horse, and suffer him to go on his way. And so it came to pass that the king found himself once more at large, and marvelled to have won so lightly to liberty. Yet knew he not the depths of treachery in the heart of a Nor, for when she found she might not prevail with the king, she bethought her how, by mortal means, she might bring the king to dishonour and death. And so, by her magic art, she caused the king to follow a path that brought him to a fountain, whereby a knight had his tent, and for love of adventure held the way against all comers. Now this knight was Sir Pellinore, and at the time he had not his equal for strength and knightly skill, nor had any been found that might stand against him. So as the king drew nigh, Pellinore cried, "Stay, knight, for none passes this way except he joust with me." "That is no good custom," said the king. "It were well that ye followed it no more." "It is my custom, and I will follow it still," answered Pellinore. "If ye like it or not, amend it if ye may." "I will do my endeavour," said Arthur, "but, as ye see, I have no spear." "Nay, I seek not to have you at advantage," replied Pellinore, and bade his squire give Arthur a spear. Then they dressed their shields, laid their lances in rest, and rushed upon each other. Now the king was wearied by his night's vigil, and the strength of Pellinore was as the strength of 3 men, so at the first encounter Arthur was unhorsed. Then said he, "I have lost the honour on horseback, but now will I encounter thee with my sword and on foot." "I too will alight," said Pellinore. "Small honour to me were it if I slew thee on foot, I being horsed the while." So they encountered each other on foot, and so fiercely they fought that they hewed off great pieces of each other's armour, and the ground was dyed with their blood. But at the last Arthur's sword broke off short at the hilt, and so he stood all defenceless before his foe. "I have thee now," cried Pellinore. "Yield thee as recreant, or I will slay thee." "That will I never," said the king. "Slay me if thou canst." Then he sprang on Pellinore, caught him by the middle, and flung him to the ground, himself falling with him. And Sir Pellinore marvelled, for never before had he encountered so bold and resolute a foe. But exerting his great strength, he rolled himself over, and so brought Arthur beneath him. Then had Arthur perished, but at that moment Merlin stood beside him, and when Sir Pellinore would have struck off the king's head, stayed his blow, crying, "Pellinore, if thou slayest this knight, thou puttest the whole realm in peril, for this is none other than King Arthur himself." Then was Pellinore filled with dread, and cried, "Better make an end of him at once, for if I suffer him to live, what hope have I of his grace that have dealt with him so sorely?" But before Pellinore could strike, Merlin caused a deep sleep to come upon him, and raising King Arthur from the ground, he staunched his wounds and recovered him of his swoon. But when the king came to himself, he saw his foe lie, still as in death, on the ground beside him, and he was grieved, and said, "Merlin, what have ye done to this brave knight? Nay, if ye have slain him, I shall grieve my life long, for a good knight he is, bold and a fair fighter, though something wanting in knightly courtesy. He is in better case than ye are, Sir King, who so lightly imperil your person, and thereby your kingdom's welfare. And, as ye say, Pellinore is a stout knight, and hereafter shall he serve you well. Have no fear, he shall wake again in 3 hours, and has suffered naught by the encounter. But for you, it were well that ye came where ye might be tended for your wounds." "Nay," replied the king, smiling, "I may not return to my court thus weaponless. First will I find means to purvey me of a sword." "That is easily done," answered Merlin. "Follow me, and I will bring you where ye shall get you a sword, the wonder of the world." So, though his pains pained him sore, the king followed Merlin by many a forest path and glade, until they came upon a mere bosomed deep in the forest, and as he looked thereon, the king beheld an arm, clothed in white samite, shoot above the surface of the lake, and in the hand was a fair sword that gleamed in the level rays of the setting sun. "This is a great marvel," said the king. "What may it mean?" And Merlin made answer, Deep is this mere, so deep indeed that no man may fathom it. But in its depths, and built upon the roots of the mountains, is the palace of the Lady of the Lake. Powerful is she, with a power that works ever for good, and she shall help thee in thine hour of need. For thee has she wrought yonder sword. Go now and take it. Then was Arthur aware of a little skiff, half hidden among the bulrushes that fringed the lake, and leaping into the boat without aid of oar, he was wafted out into the middle of the lake, to the place where, out of the water, rose the arm and sword. After leaning from the skiff, he took the sword from the hand, which forthwith vanished, and immediately thereafter the skiff bore him back to land. Arthur drew from its scabbard the mighty sword, wondering the while at the marvel of its workmanship, for the hilt shone with the light of many twinkling gems, diamond and topaz and emerald, and many another whose names none know. And as he looked on the blade, Arthur was aware of mystic writings on the one side and the other, calling to Merlin. He bade him interpret them. Sir, said Merlin, on the one side is written, Keep me, and on the other, Throw me away. Then, said the king, which does it behove me to do? Keep it, answered Merlin. The time to cast it away is not yet come. This is the good brand Excalibur, or cut steel, and well shall it serve you. But what think ye of the scabbard? A fair cover for so good a sword, answered Arthur. Nay, it is more than that, said Merlin, for so long as ye keep it, though ye be wounded, never so sore, yet ye shall not bleed to death. And when he heard that, the king marvelled the more. Then they journeyed back to Carleon, where the knights made great joy of the return of their lord. And presently thither came Sir Pellinore, craving pardon of the king, who made but jest of his own misadventure. And afterwards Sir Pellinore became of the Table Round a knight vowed, not only to deeds of hardihood, but also to gentleness and courtesy. And faithfully he served the king, fighting ever to maintain justice and put down wrong, and to defend the weak from the oppressor. Chapter 4. Of the treachery of Queen Morgan le Fay. There was a certain queen whose name was Morgan le Fay, and she was a powerful sorceress. Little do men know of her, save that in her youth she was eager for knowledge, and having learnt all human lore, turned her to magic, becoming so skilled therein that she was feared of all. There was a time when great was her enmity towards King Arthur, so that she plotted his ruin not once only nor twice, and that is a strange thing, for it is said that she herself was the kinswoman of the king. And truly in the end she repented her of her malice, for she was of those that came to bear Arthur to the delightful islands from the field of his last bitter conflict, but that was long after. Now when this enchantress learned how the Lady of the Lake had given the king a sword and scabbard of strange might, she was filled with ill will, and all her thought was only how she might wrest the weapon from him and have it for her own, to bestow as she would. Even while she pondered thereon, the king himself sent her the scabbard to keep for him, for Merlin never ceased to warn the king to have in safe keeping the scabbard that had power to keep him from mortal hurt. And it seemed to Arthur that none might better guard it for him till the hour of need than Morgan le Fay, the wise queen that was of his own kindred. Yet was not the queen ashamed of her treacherous intent by the trust that Arthur had in her, but all her mind was set on how she might win to the possession of the sword itself as well as of the scabbard. At the last, so had her desire for the sword wrought upon her, she resolved to compass the destruction of the king, that if she gained the sword, never might she have need to fear his justice for the wrong she had done. And her chance came soon, for on a day King Arthur resolved to chase the hart in the forests near Camelot, wherefore he left behind him his sword Excalibur, and took but a hunting spear with him. All day long he chased a white hart, and when evening fell he had far outstripped his attendants, save only two, Sir Accolon of Gaul, and Sir Uriens, King of Gore, the husband of Queen Morgan le Fay herself. So when the king saw that darkness had come upon them in the forest, he turned to his companions, saying, Sirs, we be far from Camelot, and must lodge as we may this night. Let us go forward until we shall find where we may shelter us a little. So they rode forward, and presently Arthur espied a little lake glinting in the beams of the rising moon, and as they drew nearer, they descried full in the moonlight a little ship all hung with silks even to the water's edge. Then said the king to his knights, Yonder is promise of shelter, or it may be of adventure. Let us tether our horses in the thicket, and enter into this little ship. And when they had so done, presently they found themselves in a fair cabin, all hung with silks and tapestries, and in its midst a table spread with the choicest fare. And being weary and hungered with the chase, they ate of the feast prepared, and laying down to rest, were soon sunk in deep slumber. While they slept, the little ship floated away from the land, and it came to pass that a great wonder befell. For when they woke in the morning, King Uriens found himself at home in his own land, and Sir Accolon was in his own chamber at Camelot. But the king lay a prisoner, bound and fettered and weaponless, in a noisome dungeon that echoed to the groans of hapless captives. When he was come to himself, King Arthur looked about him, and saw that his companions were knights in the same hard case as himself. And he inquired of them how they came to be in that plight. Sir, said one of them, we are in duress in the castle of a certain recreant knight, Sir Damas by name, a coward false to chivalry. None love him, and so no champion can he find to maintain his cause in a certain quarrel that he has in hand. For this reason he lies in wait with a great company of soldiers for any knights that may pass this way, and taking them prisoners, holds them in captivity, unless they will undertake to fight to the death in his cause. And this I would not, nor any of my companions here, but unless we be speedily rescued, we are all like to die of hunger in this loathsome dungeon. What is his quarrel? Asked the king. That we none of us know, answered the knight. While they yet talked, there entered the prison a damsel. She went up to the king at once, and said, Knight, will ye undertake to fight in the cause of the lord of this castle? That I might not say, replied the king, unless first I may hear what is his quarrel. That ye shall not know, replied the damsel. But this I tell you, if ye refuse, ye shall never leave this dungeon alive, but shall perish here miserably. This is a hard case, said the king, that I must either die or fight for one I know not, and in a cause that I may not hear. Yet on one condition will I undertake your lord's quarrel, and that is that he shall give me all the prisoners bound here in his dungeon. It shall be as ye say, answered the damsel, and ye shall also be furnished with horse and armour and sword than which ye never saw better. Therewith the damsel bade him follow her, and brought him to a great hall, where presently there came to him squires to arm him for the combat. And when their service was rendered, the damsel said to him, Sir knight, even now there has come one who greets you in the name of Queen Morgan le Fay, and bids me to tell you that the queen, knowing your need, has sent you your good sword. Then the king rejoiced greatly, for it seemed to him that the sword that the damsel gave him was none other than the good sword Excalibur. When all was prepared, the damsel led King Arthur into a fair field, and there he beheld awaiting him a knight, all sheathed in armour, his visor down, and bearing a shield on which was no blazonry. So the two knights saluted each other, and wheeling their horses, rode away from each other some little space. Then turning again, they laid lance in rest, and rushing upon each other, encountered with the noise of thunder, and so great was the shock that each knight was borne from the saddle. Swiftly they gained their feet, and drawing their swords, dealt each other great blows, and thus they contended fiercely for some while. But as he fought, a great wonder came upon Arthur, for it seemed to him that his sword, that never before had failed him, bit not upon the armor of the other, while every stroke of his enemy drew blood, till the ground on which he fought was slippery beneath his feet, and at the last almost his heart failed within him, knowing that he was betrayed, and that the brand with which he fought was not Excalibur. Yet would he not show aught of what he suffered, but struggled on, faint as he was and spent, so that they that watched the fight and saw how he was sore wounded marvelled at his great courage and endurance. But presently the stranger knight dealt the king a blow which fell upon Arthur's sword, and so fierce was the stroke that the blade broke off at the pommel. "Knight," said the other, "thou must yield thee recreant to my mercy." "That may I not do with mine honour," answered the king, "for I am sworn to fight in this quarrel to the death. But weaponless thou must needs be slain. Slay me an ye will, but think not to win glory by slaying a weaponless man." Then was the other wroth to find himself still withstood, and in his anger he dealt Arthur a great blow. But this the king shunned, and rushing upon his foe, smote him so fiercely on the head with the pommel of his broken sword that the knight swayed and let slip his own weapon. With a bound Arthur was upon the sword, and no sooner had he it within his grasp than he knew it, of a truth, to be his own sword Excalibur. Then he scanned more closely his enemy, and saw the scabbard that he wore was none other than the magic scabbard of Excalibur. And forthwith, leaping upon the knight, he tore it from him and flung it far afield. "Knight," cried King Arthur, "ye have made me suffer sore, but now is the case changed, and ye stand within my power, helpless and unarmed. And much I misdoubt me, but that treacherously ye have dealt with me. Nevertheless, yield you recreant, and I will spare your life." "That I may not do, for it is against my vow, so slay me if ye will. Of a truth, ye are the best knight that ever I encountered." Then it seemed to the king that the knight's voice was not unknown to him, and he said, "Tell me your name, and what country ye are of, for something bids me think that ye are not all unknown to me." "I am Alcohuan of Gaul, knight of King Arthur's Round Table." "Ah, Alcohuan, Alcohuan!" cried the king. "Is it even thou that hast fought against me? Almost hast thou undone me? What treason tempted thee to come against me, and with mine own weapon too?" When Sir Alcohuan knew that it was against King Arthur that he had fought, he gave a loud cry, and swooned away utterly. Then Arthur called to two stout yeomen amongst those that had looked on at the fight, and bade them bear Sir Alcohuan to a little hermitage hard by. And thither he himself followed with pain, being weak from loss of blood, but into the castle he would not enter, for he trusted not those that held it. The hermit dressed their wounds, and presently, when Sir Alcohuan had come to himself again, the king spoke gently to him, bidding him say how he had come to bear arms against him. "Sir and my lord," answered Sir Alcohuan, "it comes of naught but the treachery of your kinswoman, Queen Morgan le Fay. For on the morrow after we had entered upon the little ship, I awoke in my chamber at Camelot, and greatly I marvelled how I had come there. And as I yet wondered, there came to me a messenger from Queen Morgan le Fay, desiring me to go to her without delay. And when I entered her presence, she was as one sore troubled, and she said to me, Sir Alcohuan, of my secret power, I know that now is our king Arthur in great danger, for he lies imprisoned in a great and horrible dungeon, whence he may not be delivered unless one be found to do battle for him with the lord of the castle. Wherefore have I sent for you, that ye may take the battle upon you for our lord the king. And for greater surety I give you here Excalibur, Arthur's own sword, for of a truth we should use all means for the rescuing of our lord. And I, believing this evil woman, came hither and challenged the lord of this castle to mortal combat. And indeed I deemed it was with Sir Damas that I fought even now. Yet all was treachery, and I misdoubt me that Sir Damas and his people are in league with Queen Morgan le Fay to compass your destruction. But my lord Arthur, pardon me, I beseech you, the injuries that all unwitting I have done you." King Arthur was filled with wrath against the queen, more for the wrong done to Sir Accolon than for the treason to himself. In all ways that he might, he sought to comfort and relieve Sir Accolon, but in vain. For daily the knight grew weaker, and after many days he died. Then the king, being recovered of his wounds, returned to Camelot, and calling together a band of knights, led them against the castle of Sir Damas. But Damas had no heart to attempt to hold out, and surrendered himself and all that he had to the king's mercy. And first King Arthur set free those that Sir Damas had kept in miserable bondage, and sent them away with rich gifts. When he had righted the wrongs of others, then he summoned Sir Damas before him, and said, "I command thee that thou tell me why thou didst seek my destruction." And cringing low at the king's footstool, Damas answered, "I beseech you, deal mercifully with me for all that I have done. I have done at the bidding of Queen Morgan le Fay." "A coward's plea," said the king. "How came thou first to have traffic with her?" "Sir," replied Damas, "much have I suffered first by the greed of my younger brother, and now by the deceit of this evil woman, as ye shall hear. When my father died, I claimed the inheritance as of right, seeing that I was his elder son. But my younger brother, Sir Ontzlake, withstood me, and demanded some part of my father's lands. Long since, he sent me a challenge to decide our quarrel in single combat. But it liked me ill, seeing that I am of no great strength. Much, therefore, did I desire to find a champion, but by ill fortune none could I find, until Queen Morgan le Fay sent word that of her good will to me she had sent me one that would defend my cause. And that same evening the little ship brought you, my lord, to my castle. And when I saw you, I rejoiced, thinking to have found a champion that would silence my brother forever. Nor knew I for the king's self. Wherefore I entreat you, spare me, and avenge me on my brother." Therewith Sir Damas fawned upon the king, but Arthur sternly bade him rise, and send messengers to bring Sir Ontzlake before him. Presently there stood before the king a youth, fair and good stature, who saluted his lord, and then remained silent before him. "Sir Ontzlake," said the king, "I have sent for you to know of your dealings with Sir Accolon, and of your quarrel with your brother." "My lord Arthur," answered the youth, "that I was the cause of hurt to yourself, I pray you to pardon me. For all unwitting was I of evil. For ye shall know that I had challenged my brother to single combat, but when word came to me that he was provided of a champion, I might not so much as brook my armor for a sore wound that I had got of an arrow shot at me as I rode through the forest near the castle. And as I grieved for my hard case, there came a messenger from Queen Morgan le Fay, bidding me of good courage, for she had sent unto me one Sir Accolon, who would undertake my quarrel. This only she commanded me, that I should ask no questions of Sir Accolon. Sir Accolon abode with me that night, and, as I supposed, fought in my cause the next day. Sure am I that there is some mystery, yet may I not misdoubt my lady Queen Morgan le Fay without cause, wherefore if blame there be, let me bear the punishment." Then was the king well pleased with the young man for his courage and loyalty to others. "Fair youth," said he, "ye shall go with me to Camelot, and if ye prove you brave and just in all your doings, ye shall be of my round table." But to Sir Damas he said sternly, "Ye are a mean-spirited varlet, unworthy of the degree of knighthood. Here I ordain that ye shall yield unto your brother the moiety of the lands that ye had of your father, and in payment for it, yearly ye shall receive of Sir Ontzlake a palfrey, for that will befit you better to ride than the knightly war-horse. And look ye well to it, on pain of death, that ye lie no more in wait for errant knights, but amend your life and live peaceably with your brother." Thereafter the fear of the king kept Sir Damas from deeds of violence, yet to the end he remained cowardly and churlish, unworthy of the golden spurs of knighthood. But Sir Ontzlake proved him a valiant knight, fearing God and the king, and naught else. Chapter 5. How the Scabbard of Excalibur was lost. Now when Queen Morgan le Fay knew that her plot had miscarried, and that her treachery was discovered, she feared to abide the return of the king of Camelot, and so she went to Queen Guinevere and said, Madam, of your courtesy, grant me leave, I pray you, to depart. Nay, said the queen, that were pity, for I have news of my lord the king, that soon he will return to Camelot. Will ye not then await his return, that ye may see your kinsman before ye depart? Alas, madam, said Morgan le Fay, that may not be, for I have ill news that requires that immediately I get to my own country. Then shall ye depart when ye will, said the queen. So before the next day had dawned, Morgan le Fay arose, and taking her horse, departed unattended from Camelot. All that day and most of the night she rode fast, and ere noon the next day she was come to a nunnery, where, as she knew, King Arthur lay. Entering into the house, she made herself known to the nuns, who received her courteously and gave her of their best to eat and to drink. When she was refreshed, she asked if any other had sought shelter with them that day, and they told her that King Arthur lay in an inner chamber and slept, for he had rested little for 3 nights. Ah, my dear lord, exclaimed the false sorceress, gladly would I speak with him, but I will not that ye awaken him, and long I may not tarry here, wherefore suffer me at least to look upon him as he sleeps, and then will I continue my journey. And the nuns, suspecting no treachery, showed Queen Morgan le Fay the room where King Arthur slept, and let her enter it alone. So Morgan le Fay had her will, and stood beside the sleeping king. But again it seemed as if she must fail of her purpose, and her heart was filled with rage and despair. For she saw that the king grasped in his hand the hilt of the naked brand, that none might take it without awakening him. While she mused, suddenly she espied the scabbard where it hung at the foot of the bed, and her heart rejoiced to know that something she might gain by her bold venture. She snatched up the empty sheath, and wrapping it in a fold of her garment, left the chamber. Brief were her farewells to the holy nuns, and in haste she got to horse and rode away. Scarcely had she set forth when the king awoke, and rising from his couch, saw at once that the scabbard of his sword was gone. Then summoned he the whole household to his presence, and inquired who had entered his chamber. Sir, said the abbess, there has none been here save only your kinswoman, the Queen Morgan le Fay. She, indeed, desired to look upon you, since she might not abide your awakening. Then the king groaned aloud, saying, It is my own kinswoman, the wife of my true knight Sir Uriens, that would betray me. He bade Sir Ontzlake make ready to accompany him, and after courteous salutation to the abbess and her nuns, together they rode forth by the path that Morgan le Fay had taken. Fast they rode in pursuit, and presently they came to a cross where a poor cowherd keeping watch over his few beasts, and of him they asked whether any had passed that way. Sirs, said the peasant, even now there rode past the cross a lady most lovely to look upon, and with her 40 knights. Greatly the king marvelled how Queen Morgan le Fay had come by such a cavalcade, but nothing he doubted that it was she the cowherd had seen. So thanking the poor man, the king, with Sir Ontzlake, rode on by the path that had been shown them, and presently, emerging from the forest, they were aware of a glittering company of horsemen winding through a wide plain that lay stretched before them. On the instant they put spurs to their horses and galloped as fast as they might in pursuit. But as it chanced, Queen Morgan le Fay looked back even as Arthur and Sir Ontzlake came forth from the forest, and seeing them she knew at once that her theft had been discovered, and that she was pursued. Straightway she bade her knights ride on till they should come to a narrow valley where lay many great stones. But as soon as they had left her, she herself rode with all speed to a mere hard by. Sullen and still it lay, without even a ripple on its surface. No animal ever drank of its waters, nor bird sang by it, and it was so deep that none might even plumb it. And when the queen had come to the brink, she dismounted. From the folds of her dress she drew the scabbard, and waving it above her head, she cried, Whatsoever becometh of me, King Arthur shall not have the scabbard. Then, whirling it with all her might, she flung it far into the mere. The jewels glinted as the scabbard flashed through the air. Then it clove the oily waters of the lake and sank, never again to be seen. When it had vanished, Morgan Le Fay mounted her horse again and rode fast after her knights, for the king and Onslake were in hot pursuit, and sore she feared lest they should come up with her before she might reach the shelter of the Valley of Stones. But she had rejoined her company of knights before the king had reached the narrow mouth of the valley. Quickly she bade her men scatter among the boulders, and then, by her magic art, she turned them all, men and horses and herself too, into stones, that none might tell the one from the other. When King Arthur and Sir Onslake reached the valley, they looked about for some sign of the presence of the queen or her knights, but naught might they see through. They rode through the valley and beyond, and returning, searched with all diligence among the rocks and boulders. Never again was Queen Morgan Le Fay seen at Camelot, nor did she attempt aught afterwards against the welfare of the king. When she had restored her knights to their proper form, she hastened with them back to her own land, and where she abode for the rest of her days, until she came with the other queens to carry Arthur from the field of the battle in the west. Nor would the king seek to take vengeance on a woman, though sorely she had wronged him. His life long he guarded well the sword Excalibur, but the sheath no man ever saw again. Chapter 6. Merlin. Of Merlin and how he served King Arthur, something has been already shown. Loyal he was ever to Uther Pendragon and to his son King Arthur, and for the latter especially he wrought great marvels. He brought the king to his rights, he made him his ships, and some say that Camelot, with its splendid halls where Arthur would gather his knights around him at the great festivals of the year, at Christmas, at Easter, and at Pentecost, was raised by his magic, without human toil. Blaise, the aged magician who dwelt in Northumberland and recorded the great deeds of Arthur and his knights, had been Merlin's master in magic. But it came to pass in time that Merlin far excelled him in skill, so that his enemies declared no mortal was his father, and called him Devil's son. Then on a certain time Merlin said to Arthur, "The time draws near when ye shall miss me, for I shall go down alive into the earth, and it shall be that gladly would ye give your lands to have me again." Then Arthur was grieved, and said, "Since ye know your danger, use your craft to avoid it." But Merlin answered, "That may not be." Now there had come to Arthur's court a damsel of the Lady of the Lake, her whose skill in magic, some say, was greater than Merlin's own, and the damsel's name was Vivien. She set herself to learn the secrets of Merlin's art, and was ever with him, tending upon the old man, and with gentleness and tender service winning her way to his heart. But all was a pretence, for she was weary of him, and sought only his ruin, thinking it should be fame for her, by any means whatsoever, to enslave the greatest wizard of his age. And so she persuaded him to pass with her overseas into King Ban's land of Benwick, and there one day he showed her a wondrous rock formed by magic art. Then she begged him to enter into it, the better to declare to her its wonders. But when once he was within, by a charm that she had learned from Merlin's self, she caused the rock to shut down, that never again might he come forth. Thus was Merlin's prophecy fulfilled, that he should go down into the earth alive. Much they marvelled in Arthur's court what had become of the great magician, till on a time there rode past the stone a certain knight of the Round Table, and heard Merlin lamenting his sad fate. The knight would have striven to raise the mighty stone, but Merlin bade him not waste his labour, since none might release him save her who had imprisoned him there. Thus Merlin passed from the world through the treachery of a damsel, and thus Arthur was without aid in the days when his doom came upon him. Chapter 7. Balin and Balin. Among the princes that thought scorn of Arthur in the days when first he became king, none was more insolent than Rions of North Wales. So, on a time when King Arthur held high festival at Camelot, Rions sent a herald, who, in the presence of the whole court, before brave knights and fair dames, thus addressed the king. "Sir Arthur, My master bids me say that he has overcome 11 kings with all their hosts, and, in token of their submission, they have given him their beards to fringe him in a mantle. There remains yet space for the 12th, wherefore with all speed send him your beard, else will he lay waste your land with fire and sword. Viler message, said King Arthur, was never sent from man to man. Get thee gone, lest we forget thine office protects thee. So spoke the king, for he had seen his knights clap hand to sword, and would not that a messenger should suffer hurt in his court. Now among the knights present the while was one whom men called Balin le Savage, who had but late been freed from prison for slaying a knight in Arthur's court. None was more wroth than he at the villainy of Rions, and immediately after the departure of the herald he left the hall and armed him, for he was minded to try if with good fortune he might win to Arthur's grace by avenging him on the king of North Wales. While he was without, there entered the hall a witch lady, who on a certain occasion had done the king a service, and for this she now desired of him a boon. So Arthur bade her name her request, and thus she said, O king, I require of you the head of the knight Balin le Savage. That may I not grant you, with my honour, replied the king. Ask what it may become me to give. But the witch lady would have naught else, and departed from the hall murmuring against the king. Then, as it chanced, Balin met her at the door, and immediately when he saw her, he rode upon her, sword in hand, and with one blow smote off her head. Thus he took vengeance for his mother's death, of which she had been the cause, and well content rode away. But when it was told King Arthur of the deed that Balin had done, he was full wroth, nor was his anger lessened, though Merlin declared the wrong the witch lady had done to Balin. Whatsoever cause he had against her, yet should he have done her no violence in my court, said the king, and bade Sir Launcelot of Ireland ride after Balin and bring him back again. Thus it came to pass that as Sir Balin rode on his way, he heard the hoof-beats of a horse fast galloping, and a voice cried loudly to him, Stay, knight, for thou shalt stay, whether thou wilt or not. Fair knight, answered Balin fiercely, dost thou desire to fight with me? Yea, truly, answered Launcelot, for that cause have I followed thee from Camelot. Alas, cried Balin, then I know thy quarrel, and yet I dealt but justly by that vile woman, and it grieves me to offend my lord King Arthur again. Have done, and make ready to fight, said Launcelot insolently, for he was proud and arrogant, though a brave knight. So they rushed together, and at the first encounter Sir Launcelot's spear was shivered against the shield of the other. But Balin's spear pierced shield and hauberk, and Launcelot fell death to the earth. Then Sir Balin, sore grieved that he had caused the death of a knight of Arthur's court, buried Launcelot as well as he might, and continued sorrowfully on his journey in search of King Rions. Presently, as he rode through a great forest, he espied a knight whom by his arms he knew at once for his brother, Sir Balin. Great joy had they in their meeting, for Balin had believed Balin still to be in prison. So Balin told Balin all that had befallen him, and how he sought Rions to avenge Arthur upon him for his insolent message, and hoped thereby to win his lord's favour again. I will ride with thee, brother, said Balin, and help thee as I may. So the two went on their way till presently they met with an old man, Merlin's self, though they knew him not, for he was disguised. Ah, knight, said Merlin to Balin, swift to strike and swift to repent, beware, or thou shalt strike the most dolorous blow dealt by man, for thou shalt slay thy own brother. If I believed thy words true, cried Balin hotly, I would slay myself to make thee a liar. I know the past, and I know the future, said Merlin. I know too the errand on which thou ridest, and I will help thee, if thou wilt. Ah, said Balin, that pleases me well. Hide you both in this covert, said Merlin, for presently there shall come riding down this path King Rions with 60 of his knights. With these words he vanished. So Balin and Balin did as he had bidden them, and when King Rions and his men entered the little path, they fell upon them with such fury that they slew more than 40 knights, while the rest fled, and King Rions himself yielded him to them. So Sir Balin rode with King Rience to Camelot, that he might deliver him to King Arthur. But Balin went not with them, for he would see more adventures before he sought King Arthur's presence again. After many days' travel and many encounters, it befell that one evening Balin drew near to a castle, and when he would have sought admittance, there stood by him an old man, and said, Balin, turn thee back, and it shall be better for thee, and so vanished. At that moment there was blown a blast on a horn, such as is sounded when the stag receives its death. And hearing it, Balin's heart misgave him, and he cried, That blast is blown for me, and I am the prize, but not yet am I dead. At that instant the castle gate was raised, and there appeared many knights and ladies welcoming Balin into the castle. So he entered, and presently they were all seated at supper. Then the lady of the castle said to Balin, Sir knight, tomorrow thou must have ado with a knight that keeps an island near by, else mayest thou not pass that way. That is an evil custom, answered Balin, but if I must, I must. So that night he rested, but with the dawn he rose, and was arming himself for battle, when there came to him a knight, and said, Sir, your shield is not good. I pray you, take mine, which is larger and stouter. In an evil hour Balin suffered himself to be persuaded, and taking the stranger's shield, left behind his own on which his arms were blazoned. Then, entering a boat, he was conveyed to the island where the unknown knight held the ford. No sooner was he landed than there came riding to him a knight armed all in red armor, his horse too trapped all in red. And without word spoken they charged upon each other, and each bore the other from their saddle. Thus for a while they lay, stunned by the fall. The Red Knight was the first to rise, for Balin, all wearied from his travels and many encounters, was sore shaken by the fall. Then they fought together right fiercely, hacking away great pieces of armor, and dealing each other dreadful wounds. But when they paused to take a breath, Balin, looking up, saw the battlements of the castle filled with knights and ladies watching the struggle, and immediately, shamed that the conflict should have so long endured, he rushed again upon the Red Knight, aiming at him blows that might have felled a giant. So they fought together a long while, but at the last the Red Knight drew back a little. Then cried Balin, Who art thou? For till now never have I met my match. Then said the Red Knight, I am Balin, brother to the noble knight Sir Balin. And with the word he fell to the ground as one dead. Alas, cried Balin, that I should have lived to see this day. Then, as well as he might, for his strength was almost spent, he crept on hands and knees to his brother's side and opened the visor of his helmet. And when he saw his brother's face all ghastly as it was, he cried, O Balin, I have slain thee, as thou hast also slain me. O woeful deed, never to be forgotten of men. Then Balin, being somewhat recovered, told Balin how he had been compelled by those at the castle to keep the ford against all comers, and might never depart. And Balin told of the grievous chance by which he had taken another's shield. So these two died, slain by each other's hands. In one tomb they were buried, and Merlin, passing that way, inscribed thereon the full story of their deaths. End of The Coming of Arthur, by Beatrice Clay.
Endymion, from A Book of Myths, by Jean Lang. To the modern popular mind, perhaps none of the goddesses of Greece, not even Venus herself, has more appeal than has the huntress goddess Diana. Those who know but little of ancient statuary can still brighten to intelligent recognition of the huntress with her quiver and her little stag when they meet with them in picture gallery or suburban garden. That unlettered sportsman in weather-worn pink, slowly riding over the fragrant dead leaves by the muddy roadside on this chill gray morning, may never have heard of Artemis, but he is quite ready to make intelligent reference to Diana, to the handsome young sportswoman whom he finds by the covert side. And Sir Walter's Diana Vernon has helped the little red public to realize that the original Diana was a goddess worthy of being sponsor to one of the finest heroines of fiction. But not to the sportsman alone, but also to the youth or maid who loves the moon, they know not why, to those whom the shadows of trees on a woodland path at night mean a grip of the heart, while pale Dion, scuds over the dark clouds that are soaring beyond the treetops and is peeping, chaste and pale, through the branches of the firs and giant pines, there is something arresting, enthralling in the thought of the goddess Diana, who now has for hunting ground the blue firmament of heaven, where the pale Pleiades glitter like a swarm of fireflies tangled in a silver braid. Tennyson. She gleans her sylvan trophies down the wold. She hears the sobbing of the stags that flee, mixed with the music of the hunting rolled, but her delight is all in archery, and naught of ruth and pity wotteth she more than her hounds that follow on the flight. The goddess draws a golden bow of might, and thick she rains the gentle shafts that slay. She tosses loose her locks upon the night, and through the dim wood Dian threads her way. Andrew Lang. Again and again in mythological history we come on stories of the goddess, sometimes under her best-known name of Diana, sometimes under her older Greek name of Artemis, and now and again as Selene, the moon goddess, the Luna of the Romans. Her twin brother was Apollo, god of the sun, and with him she shared the power of unerringly wielding a bow, and of sending grave plagues and pestilences, while both were patrons of music and poetry. When the sun god's golden chariot had driven down into the west, then would his sister's noiseless-footed silver steeds be driven across the sky, while the huntress shot from her bow at will silent arrows that would slay without warning a joyous young mother with her newly born babe, or would wantonly pierce, with a lifelong pain, the heart of some luckless mortal. Now one night, as she passed Mount Latmos, there chanced to be a shepherd lad lying asleep beside his sleeping flock. Many times had Endymion watched the goddess from afar, half afraid of one so beautiful and yet so ruthless. But never before had Diana realized the youth's wonderful beauty. She checked her hounds when they would have swept on in their chase through the night, and stood beside Endymion. She judged him to be as perfect as her own brother, Apollo, yet more perfect, perhaps, for on his upturned sleeping face was the silver glamour of her own dear moon. Fierce and burning passion could come with the sun's rays, but love that came in the moon's pale light was passion mixed with gramarye. She gazed for long, and when, in his sleep, Endymion smiled, she knelt beside him and, stooping, gently kissed his lips. The touch of a moonbeam on a sleeping rose was no more gentle than was Diana's touch, yet it was sufficient to wake Endymion, and as, while one's body sleeps on, one's half-waking mind, now and again in a lifetime, seems to realize an ecstasy of happiness so perfect that one dares not wake, lest, by waking, the wings of one's realized ideal should slip between grasping fingers and so escape forever. So did Endymion realize the kiss of the goddess. But before his sleepy eyes could be his senses' witness, Diana had hastened away. Endymion, springing to his feet, saw only his sleeping flock, nor did his dogs awake when he heard what seemed to him to be the baying of hounds in full cry in a forest far up the mountain. Only to his own heart did he dare to whisper what was this wonderful thing that he believed had befallen him, and although he laid himself down, hoping that once again this miracle might be granted to him, no miracle came, nor could he sleep, so great was his longing. All the next day through the sultry hours, while Apollo drove his chariot of burnished gold through the land, Endymion, as he watched his flocks, tried to dream his dream once more, and longed for the day to end and the cool, dark night to return. When night came, he tried to lie awake and see what might befall. But when kind sleep had closed his tired eyes, there came a lovely vision of a maid, who seemed to step as from a golden car out of the low-hung moon. Lewis Morris. Always she kissed him, yet when her kiss awoke him, he could never see anything more tangible than a shaft of silver moonlight on the moving bushes of the mountainside. never hear anything more real than the far-away echo of the baying of pursuing hounds. And if, with eager, greatly daring eyes, he looked skywards, a dark cloud, so it seemed to him, would always hasten to hide the moon from his longing gaze. In this manner, time passed on. The days of Endymion were filled by longing daydreams. His sleeping hours ever brought him ecstasy. Ever, too, to the goddess, the human being that she loved seemed to her to grow more precious. For her, all the joy of day and of night was concentrated in the moments she spent by the side of the sleeping Endymion. The flocks of the shepherd flourished like those of no other herd. No wild beast dared come near them. No storm nor disease assailed them. Yet, for Endymion, the things of earth no longer held any value. He lived only for his dear dream's sake. Had he been permitted to grow old and worn and tired, and still a dreamer, who knows how his story might have ended? But to Diana there came the fear that with age his beauty might wane, and from her father Zeus she obtained for the one she loved the gifts of unending youth and of eternal sleep. There came a night when the dreams of Endymion had no end. That was a night when the moon made for herself broad silver paths across the sea, from far horizon to the shore where the little waves lapped and curled in a radiant, ever-moving silver fringe. Silver also were the leaves of the forest trees, and between the branches of the solemn cypresses and of the stately dark pines, Diana shot her silver arrows. No baying of hounds came then to make Endymion's flocks move uneasily in their sleep, but the silver stars seemed to sing in unison together. While still those gentle lips touched his, hands as gentle lifted up the sleeping Endymion and bore him to a secret cave in Mount Latmos, and there, forevermore, she came to kiss the mouth of her sleeping lover. There, forever, slept Endymion, happy in the perfect bliss of dreams that have no ugly awaking, of an ideal love that knows no ending. End of Endymion, from A Book of Myths by Jean Lang.
The Forest Bride by Parker Fillmore. There was once a farmer who had 3 sons. One day, when the boys were grown to manhood, he said to them, "My sons, it is high time that you were all married. Tomorrow I wish you to go out in search of brides." "But where shall we go?" the oldest son asked. "I have thought of that too," the father said. "Do each of you chop down a tree, and then take the direction in which the fallen tree points. I'm sure that each of you, if you go far enough in that direction, will find a suitable bride." So the next day, the 3 sons chopped down trees. The oldest son's tree fell pointing north. "That suits me," he said, for he knew that to the north lay a farm where a very pretty girl lived. The tree of the second son, when it fell, pointed south. "That suits me," the second son declared, thinking of a girl that he had often danced with who lived on a farm to the south. The youngest son's tree, the youngest son's name was Vaco, when it fell, pointed straight to the forest. "Ha ha," the older brothers laughed. "Vaco will have to go courting one of the wolf girls or one of the foxes." They meant by this that only animals lived in the forest, and they thought they were making a good joke at Vaco's expense. But Vaco said he was perfectly willing to take his chances and go where his tree pointed. The older brothers went gaily off and presented their suits to the 2 farmers whose daughters they admired. Vaco, too, started off with brave front, but after he had gone some distance in the forest, his courage began to ebb. "How can I find a bride," he asked himself, "in a place where there are no human creatures at all?" Just then he came to a little hut. He pushed the door open and went in. It was empty. To be sure, there was a little mouse sitting on the table, daintily combing her whiskers, but a mouse, of course, doesn't count. "There's nobody here," Vaco said aloud. The little mouse paused in her toilet and, turning towards him, said reproachfully, "Why, Vaco, I'm here." "But you don't count. You're only a mouse." "Of course I count," the little mouse declared. "But tell me, what were you hoping to find?" "I was hoping to find a sweetheart." The little mouse questioned him further, and Vaco told her the whole story of his brothers and the trees. "The two older ones are finding sweethearts easily enough," Vaco said, "but I don't see how I can, off here in the forest. And it will shame me to have to go home and confess that I alone have failed." "See here, Vaco," the little mouse said, "why don't you take me for your sweetheart?" Vaco laughed heartily. "But you're only a mouse. Who ever heard of a man having a mouse for a sweetheart?" The mouse shook her little head solemnly. "Take my word for it, Vaco, you could do much worse than have me for a sweetheart. Even if I am only a mouse, I can love you and be true to you." She was a dear, dainty little mouse, and as she sat looking up at Vaco, with her little paws under her chin and her bright little eyes sparkling, Vaco liked her more and more. Then she sang Vaco a pretty little song, and the song cheered him up so much that he forgot his disappointment at not finding a human sweetheart, and as he left her to go home, he said, "Very well, little mouse, I'll take you for my sweetheart." At that, the mouse made little squeaks of delight, and she told him that she'd be true to him and wait for him no matter how long he was in returning. Well, the older brothers, when they got home, boasted loudly about their sweethearts. "Mine," said the oldest, "has the rosiest, reddest cheeks you ever saw." "And mine," the second announced, "has long yellow hair." Vaco said nothing. "What's the matter, Vaco?" the older brothers asked him, laughing. "Has your sweetheart pretty pointed ears or sharp white teeth?" You see, they were still having their little joke about foxes and wolves. "You needn't laugh," Vaco said. "I found a sweetheart. She's a gentle, dainty little thing, gowned in velvet." "Gowned in velvet," echoed the oldest brother with a frown. "Just like a princess," the second brother sneered. "Yes," Vaco repeated, "gowned in velvet like a princess. And when she sits up and sings to me, I'm perfectly happy." "Huh," grunted the older brothers, not at all pleased that Vaco should have so grand a sweetheart. "Well," said the old farmer after a few days, "now I should like to know what those sweethearts of yours are able to do. Have them each bake me a loaf of bread so that I can see whether they're good housewives." "Mine will be able to bake bread, I'm sure of that," the oldest brother declared boastfully. "So will mine," chorused the second brother. Vaco was silent. "What about the princess?" they said with a laugh. "Do you think the princess can bake bread?" "I don't know," Vaco answered truthfully. "I'll have to ask her." Of course, he had no reason for supposing that the little mouse could bake bread, and by the time he reached the hut in the forest, he was feeling sad and discouraged. When he pushed open the door, he found the little mouse, as before, seated on the table, daintily combing her whiskers. At sight of Vaco, she danced about with delight. "I'm so glad to see you," she squeaked. "I knew you would come back." When she noticed that he was silent, she asked him what was the matter. Vaco told her. "My father wants each of our sweethearts to bake him a loaf of bread. If I come home without a loaf, my brothers will laugh at me." "You won't have to go home without a loaf," the little mouse said. "I can bake bread." Vaco was much surprised at this. "I never heard of a mouse that could bake bread." "Well, I can," the little mouse insisted. With that, she began ringing a small silver bell. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. Instantly there was the sound of hurrying footsteps, tiny, scratchy footsteps, and hundreds of mice came running into the hut. The little princess mouse, sitting up very straight and dignified, said to them, Each of you, go fetch me a grain of the finest wheat." All the mice scampered quickly away and soon returned one by one, each carrying a grain of the finest wheat. After that, it was no trick at all for the Princess Mouse to bake a beautiful loaf of wheaten bread. The next day, the 3 brothers presented their father the loaves of their sweethearts' baking. The oldest one had a loaf of rye bread. "Very good," the farmer said. "For hard-working people like us, rye bread is good." The loaf the second son had was made of barley. "Barley bread is also good," the farmer said. But when Vaco presented his loaf of beautiful wheaten bread, his father cried out, "What? White bread? Ah, Vaco now must have a sweetheart of wealth." "Of course," the older brother sneered. "Didn't he tell us she was a princess?" "Say, Vaco, when a princess wants fine white flour, how does she get it?" Vaco answered simply. "She rings a little silver bell, and when her servants come in, she tells them to bring her grains of the finest wheat." At this, the older brothers nearly exploded with envy until their father had to reprove them. "There, there," he said. "Don't grudge the boy his good luck. Each girl has baked the loaf she knows how to make, and each one, in her own way, will probably make a good wife. But before you bring them home to me, I want one further test of their skill in housewifery. Let them each send me a sample of their weaving." The older brothers were delighted at this, for they knew that their sweethearts were skillful weavers. "We'll see how her ladyship fares this time," they said, sure in their hearts that Vaco's sweetheart, whoever she was, would not put them to shame with her weaving. Vaco, too, had serious doubts of the little mouse's ability at the loom. "Who ever heard of a mouse that could weave?" he said to himself as he pushed open the door of the forest hut. "Oh, there you are at last," the little mouse squeaked joyfully. She reached out her little paws in welcome, and then in her excitement, she began dancing about on the table. "Are you really glad to see me, little mouse?" Vaco asked. "Indeed I am," the mouse declared. "Am I not your sweetheart? I've been waiting for you and waiting, just wishing that you would return. Does your father want something more this time, Vaco?" "Yes, and it's something I'm afraid you can't give me, little mouse." "Perhaps I can. Tell me what it is." "It's a sample of your weaving." "I don't believe you can weave. I never heard of a mouse that could weave." "Tut, tut," said the mouse. "Of course I can weave. It would be a strange thing if Vaco's sweetheart couldn't weave." She rang the little silver bell. Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. And instantly there was the faint scratch-scratch of 100 little feet as mice came running in from all directions and sat up on their haunches, awaiting their princess's orders. "Go, each of you," she said, "and get me a fiber of flax, the finest there is." The mice went scurrying off, and soon they began returning one by one, each bringing a fiber of flax. When they had spun the flax and carded it, the little mouse wove a beautiful piece of fine linen. It was so sheer that she was able, when she folded it, to put it into an empty nutshell. "Here, Vaco," she said, "here in this little box is a sample of my weaving. I hope your father will like it." Vaco, when he got home, felt almost embarrassed, for he was sure that his sweetheart's weaving would shame his brothers. So at first he kept the nutshell hidden in his pocket. The sweetheart of the oldest brother had sent as a sample of her weaving a square of coarse cotton. "Not very fine," the farmer said, "but good enough." The second brother's sample was a square of cotton and linen mixed. "A little better," the farmer said, nodding his head. Then he turned to Vaco. "And you, Vaco, has your sweetheart not given you a sample of her weaving?" Vaco handed his father a nutshell, at sight of which his brothers burst out laughing. "Ha, ha, ha," they laughed. "Vaco's sweetheart gives him a nut when he asks for a sample of her weaving." But their laughter died as the farmer opened the nutshell and began shaking out a great web of the finest linen. "Why, Vago, my boy," he cried, "however did your sweetheart get threads for so fine a web?" Vago answered modestly. She rang a little silver bell and ordered her servants to bring her in fibers of finest flax. They did so, and after they had spun the flax and carded it, my sweetheart wove the web you see. "Wonderful," gasped the farmer. "I have never known such a weaver." "The other girls will be all right for farmers' wives, but Vago's sweetheart might be a princess." "Well," concluded the farmer, "it's time that you all brought your sweethearts home. I want to see them with my own eyes. Suppose you bring them tomorrow." "She's a good little mouse, and I'm very fond of her," Vago thought to himself as he went out to the forest. "But my brothers will certainly laugh when they find out she is only a mouse. Well, I don't care if they do laugh. She's been a good little sweetheart to me, and I'm not going to be ashamed of her." So when he got to the hut, he told the little mouse at once that his father wanted to see her. The little mouse was greatly excited. "I must go in proper style," she said. She rang the little silver bell and ordered her coach and 5. The coach, when it came, turned out to be an empty nutshell, and the 5 prancing steeds that were drawing it were 5 black mice. The little mouse seated herself in the coach with a coachman mouse on the box in front of her and a footman mouse on the box behind her. "Oh, how my brothers will laugh," thought Vago. But he didn't laugh. He walked beside the coach and told the little mouse not to be frightened, that he would take good care of her. His father, he told her, was a gentle old man and would be kind to her. When they left the forest, they came to a river which was spanned by a footbridge. Just as Vago and the nutshell coach had reached the middle of the bridge, a man met them coming from the opposite direction. "Mercy me," the man exclaimed as he caught sight of the strange little coach that was rolling along beside Vago. "What's that?" He stooped down and looked, and then with a loud laugh, he put out his foot and pushed the coach, the little mouse, her servants, and her 5 prancing steeds, all off the bridge and into the water below. "What have you done? What have you done?" Vago cried. "You've drowned my poor little sweetheart." The man, thinking Vago was crazy, hurried away. Vago, with tears in his eyes, looked down into the water. "You poor little mouse," he said. "How sorry I am that you are drowned. You were a faithful, loving sweetheart, and now that you are gone, I know how much I loved you." As he spoke, he saw a beautiful coach of gold, drawn by 5 glossy horses, go up the far bank of the river. A coachman in gold lace held the reins, and a footman in pointed cap sat up stiffly behind. The most beautiful girl in the world was seated in the coach. Her skin was as red as a berry and as white as snow. Her long golden hair gleamed with jewels, and she was dressed in pearly velvet. She beckoned to Vago, and when he came close, she said, "Won't you come sit beside me?" "Me? Me?" Vago stammered, too dazed to think. The beautiful creature smiled. "You are not ashamed to have me for a sweetheart when I was a mouse," she said. "And surely now that I am a princess again, you won't desert me." "A mouse?" Vago gasped. "Were you the little mouse?" The princess nodded. "Yes, I was the little mouse, under an evil enchantment, which could never have been broken if you had not taken me for a sweetheart, and if another human being had not drowned me. Now the enchantment is broken forever. So come, we will go to your father, and after he has given us his blessing, we will get married and go home to my kingdom." And that's exactly what they did. They drove at once to the farmer's house, and when Vaco's father and his brothers' sweethearts saw the princess's coach stopping at their gate, they all came out bowing and scraping to see what such grand folk could want of them. "Father," Vaco cried, "don't you know me?" The farmer stopped bowing long enough to look up. "Why, bless my soul," he cried, "it's our Vaco." "Yes, Father, I'm Vaco, and this is the princess that I'm going to marry." "A princess, did you say, Vaco? Mercy me, where did my boy find a princess?" "Out in the forest where my tree pointed." "Well, well, well," the farmer said, "where your tree pointed. I've always heard that was a good way to find a bride." The older brothers shook their heads gloomily and muttered, "Just our luck. If only our trees had pointed to the forest, we, too, should have found princesses instead of plain country wenches." But they were wrong. It wasn't because his tree pointed to the forest that Vaco got the princess. It was because he was so simple and good that he was even kind to a little mouse. Well, after they had got the farmer's blessing, they rode home to the princess's kingdom and were married. And they were happy as they should have been, for they were good and true to each other, and they loved each other dearly. End of The Forest Bride by Parker Fillmore.
The Giant Pyramid Builder, from a Book of Giants, Tales of Very Tall Men of Myth, Legend, History, and Science, by Henry Wysham Lanier. If you travel through that beautiful land of lakes and mountains north of the city of Mexico, you will hardly fail to visit the ancient sacred city of Cholula, nor can you fail to marvel at the remains of that incredible pyramid, 4 times as large as the famous Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt. Cortez and his followers wondered at the 50-acre structure nearly 4 centuries back. Humboldt measured it, studied it, and speculated about it 100 years ago. The general belief was that it had always been devoted to the worship of Quetzal, that fair god of old Mexico. But there were once wise ancients among the Alcohuan Indians who remembered the truth passed down by tradition from times immemorial. This is the tale of the Pyramid Builder. As everyone knows, for 4,800 years after the creation of the world, the land of Anahuac was inhabited by a race of vast giants. Have not their bones, dwarfing those of modern men, been dug up time and again throughout the centuries? These monsters were enemies both of gods and men. Fierce were the wars waged against them by the people of Tlaxcala, and many a giant was overcome by their multitudes, or driven forth into the wilderness to perish of starvation. Always, however, there were enough of the dreadful race left to keep the land in an uproar, and particularly one, Chelhua, and his 6 brothers defied all attempts against them, holding themselves above the laws, and doing only that which pleased their own ruthless cruelty. Very crafty, as well as very strong they were, and the land of Anahuac groaned beneath their devastating tread. Finding there was none alive who might resist them, they waxed arrogant past belief, and scorned the very gods above, confident that there was no power in earth or heaven which could resist their will. But at last, the heavenly rulers grew wearied of this senseless tumult below. They determined to put an end to it all, and poured forth an overwhelming deluge on the earth. The clouds burst wide and precipitated their inexhaustible reservoirs. The irresistible ocean itself was loosed from its bounds. The underground rivers shot up from beneath the earth upon men and giants alike, and those who were not drowned were transformed into fishes. All except crafty Chelhua and his 6 brothers. As the flood from above met the rising sea, they fled northward, climbed the lofty slopes of Mount Tlaloc, and hid themselves in 7 caverns within its sides, rolling huge boulders in front of the openings to shut out the waters should they rise so high. Here they lay secure, while the deluge raged unchecked throughout the universe. When the appointed time came, the destroying waters withdrew to their stations above the clouds, beneath the earth, and in the ocean. Chelhua and his brothers came forth from their caves of refuge, the only living creatures, and by their arts peopled the earth with a new race, who were to be their servants. They were now more arrogant than before, for had they not succeeded in evading the utmost wrath of the gods? So Chelhua, who was skilled in building, determined to erect a structure such as the world had not yet seen, to serve not only as a perpetual memorial of his triumph, but also as an easier means of escape from any future attempt made against him by the lords of the winds and waters. On the plain of Cholula, this edifice was staked out, 4-sided, in girth like some great hill, in height planned to pierce the very clouds aloft. In faraway Tlamanalco, at the foot of the Sierra, a multitude of men were set to work at digging clay, shaping it in molds and burning it into bricks. Instead of having these heavy loads carried across the hills, Chelhua stationed a line of workmen all the way from the brickyard to Cholula. These passed the bricks from hand to hand continually, so that the builders never lacked a supply. Bitumen, too, was similarly brought from a great distance to plaster the bricks firmly in place. Under the hands of these great myriads of workers, the foundation of the incredible pyramid grew as if it were a living thing. Day by day, it mounted upwards, and the heart of Chelhua waxed high with pride when even he had to climb laboriously to reach the dizzy level where the swarming ant-like laborers still built themselves aloft bodily. Looking upwards, he regretted that he had not planned an even larger base, for surely that was the only thing which in any way limited this monument to his power and guarantee of future security. There was one consolation. When this reached the apex of its sloping sides, he could build another, infinitely larger and loftier. Meanwhile, a future deluge must be worse than the former one to reach him upon the summit of this almost completed structure. But the gods do not sleep, though they be long silent. With rising wrath, they beheld the growth of this presumptuous edifice, and the increasing audacity of its builder. Still, they bided their time, and the pyramid of Chelhua crept upwards till the low-hanging clouds often lay far beneath its upper courses. The day came when a man might easily count the space of time still needed to complete the structure. Chelhua urged on his host of workers. Then suddenly the heavens opened. A huge mass of flaming rock fell with irresistible force upon the proud pyramid and those that built it. The upper portion crashed down in ruins, carrying to destruction thousands of the laborers and the master builder, Chelhua himself. Wherefore men doubted no longer that there were eternal powers on high. The fragment of the building which remained was dedicated thenceforth to the fair god Quetzal, and down to the time of that worthy Dominican, Pedro de los Rios, the priest showed to unbelievers a portion of the very thunderbolt, a stone shaped like a toad, which had confounded the mad presumption of Chelhua, while the dancing celebrants sang in their festival hymn the tale of these happenings, that reverence might no more perish among men. Moreover, since that day, the tribes have no longer spoken the same tongue, but each has a language of its own, unintelligible to the others. End of The Giant Pyramid Builder, from a Book of Giants, Tales of Very Tall Men of Myth, Legend, History, and Science, by Henry Wysham Lanier.
2 stories, Hinnon and the Thunderers, by Louise Spence. Many interesting myths are related of the manner in which Hinnon destroyed the monsters and giants which infested the early world. A hunter, caught in a heavy thunder shower, took refuge in the woods. Crouching under the shelter of a great tree, he became aware of a mysterious voice which urged him to follow it. He was conscious of a sensation of slowly rising from the earth, and he soon found himself gazing down from a point near the clouds, the height of many trees from the ground. He was surrounded by beings who had all the appearance of men, with one among them who seemed to be their chief. They asked him to cast his eyes toward the earth and tell them whether he could see a huge water serpent. Unable to descry such a monster, the chief anointed his eyes with a sacred ointment, which gave him supernatural sight and permitted him to behold a dragon-like shape in the watery depths far below him. The chief commanded one of his warriors to dispatch the monster, but arrow after arrow failed to transfix it, whereupon the hunter was requested to display his skill as an archer. Drawing his bow, he took careful aim. The arrow whizzed down the depths and was speedily lost to sight, but a terrible commotion arose in the lake below, the body of the great serpent leaping from the blood-stained water with dreadful writhings and contortions. So appalling was the din that rose up to them, that even the heavenly beings, by whom the hunter was surrounded, fell into a great trembling. But gradually the tempest of sound subsided, and the huge bulk of the mortally wounded serpent sank back into the lake, the surface of which became gradually more still, until finally all was peace once more. The chief thanked the hunter for the service he had rendered, and he was conducted back to earth. Thus was man first brought into contact with the beneficent Hyacinthus, and thus did he learn the existence of a power which would protect him from the forces unfriendly to humanity. The Thunderers. Once in early Iroquois days, 3 braves set out upon an expedition. After they had journeyed for some time, a misfortune occurred, one of their number breaking his leg. The others fashioned a litter with the object of carrying him back to his home, as Indian custom exacted. Retracing their steps, they came to a range of high mountains, the steep slopes of which taxed their strength to the utmost. To rest themselves, they placed the disabled man on the ground and withdrew to a little distance. "Why should we be thus burdened with a wounded man?" said one to the other. "You speak truly," was the rejoinder. "Why should we indeed, since his hurt has come upon him by reason of his own carelessness?" As they spoke, their eyes met in a meaning glance, and one of them pointed to a deep hole or pit, opening in the side of the mountain, at a little distance from the place where they were sitting. Returning to the injured man, they raised him as if about to proceed on the journey, and when passing the brink of the pit, suddenly hurled him into it with great force. Then, without loss of time, they set their faces homeward. When they arrived in camp, they reported that their comrade had died of wounds received in a fight, but that he had not fallen into the enemy's hands, having received careful attention from them in his dying moments, and honorable burial. The unfortunate man's aged mother was prostrate with grief at the sad news, but was somewhat relieved to think that her son had been kindly ministered to at the end. When the brave who had been thrown into the pit regained his senses after the severe fall he had sustained, he perceived a man of venerable aspect bending over him solicitously. When this person saw that the young man had regained consciousness, he asked him what had been the intention of his comrades in so cruelly casting him into that abyss. The young man replied that his fellows had become tired of carrying him, and had thus rid themselves of him. The old hermit, for so he seemed to be, made a hasty examination of the Indian's injuries, and announced that he would speedily cure him on one condition. The other pledged his word to accept this, whatever it may be, whereupon the recluse told him that all he required was that he should hunt for him and bring home to him such game as he should slay. To this the brave gave a ready assent. The old man lost no time in performing his part of the bargain. He applied herbs to his injuries and assiduously tended his guest, who made a speedy and satisfactory recovery. The grateful warrior, once more enabled to follow the chase, brought home many trophies of his skill as a hunter to the cave on the mountainside, and soon the pair had formed a strong attachment. One day, when in the forest, the warrior encountered an enormous bear, which he succeeded in slaying after a desperate struggle. As he was pondering how best he could remove it to the cave, he became aware of a murmur of voices behind him, and glancing round he saw 3 men, or beings in the shape of men, clad in strange diaphanous garments, standing near. In reply to his question as to what brought them there, they told him that they were the Thunderers, or people of Hyacinthus, whose mission it was to keep the earth in good order for the benefit of humanity, and to slay or destroy every agency inimical to mankind. They told him that the old man with whom he had been residing was by no means the sort of person he seemed to think, and that they had come to the earth with the express intention of compassing his destruction. In this they requested his assistance, and promised him that if he would vouchsafe it, he would speedily be transported back to his mother's lodge. Overjoyed at this proposal, the hunter did not scruple to return to the cave and tell the hermit that he had killed the bear, which he wished his help in bringing home. The old man seemed very uneasy, and begged him to examine the sky, and tell him whether he perceived the least sign of clouds. The young brave reassured him, and told him that not a cloud was to be seen, whereupon, emerging from his shelter, he made for the spot where the bear was lying. Hastily picking up the carcass, he requested his companion to place it all on his shoulders, which the young man did, expressing surprise at his strength. He had proceeded with his burden for some distance, when a terrific clap of thunder burst from the menacing black clouds which had speedily gathered overhead. In great terror, the old man threw down his load and commenced to run with an agility which belied his years. But when a second peal broke forth, he suddenly assumed the shape of a gigantic porcupine, which dashed through the undergrowth, discharging its quills like arrows as it ran. A veritable hail of thunderbolts now crashed down upon the creature's spiny back. As it reached the entrance to the cave, one larger than the rest struck it with such tremendous force that it rolled dead into its den. Then the Thunderers swooped down from the sky in triumph, mightily pleased at the death of their victim. The young hunter now requested them to discharge the promise they had made to him, to transport him back to his mother's lodge. So, having fastened cloud wings on his shoulders, they speedily brought him thither, carrying him carefully through the air and depositing him just outside the hut. The widow was delighted to see her son, whom she had believed to be long dead, and the Thunderers were so pleased with the assistance he had lent them, that they asked him to accompany them in their monster-destroying mission every spring. He assented, and on one of these expeditions flew earthward to drink from a certain pool. When he rejoined his companions, they observed that the water with which his lips were moist had caused them to shine as if smeared with oil. At their request, he indicated the pool from which he had drunk, and they informed him that in its depths there dwelt a monster for which they had searched for years. With that, they hurled a great thunderbolt into the pool, which immediately dried up, revealing an immense grub of the species which destroys standing crops. The monster was indeed king of the grubs, and his death set back the conspiracies of his kind for many generations. The youth subsequently returned to Earth, and having narrated to the members of his tribe the services which Hyacinthus had performed on their behalf, they considered it fitting to institute a special worship of the deity, and, in fact, to make him supreme god of their nation. Even today, many Iroquois allude to Hyacinthus as their grandfather, and evince extraordinary veneration at the mention of his name. End of Hyacinthus and the Thunderers by Louise Spence.
Hyacinthus by Jean Lang. The sad death of Hyacinthus, when the cruel breath of Zephyr slew him, Zephyr penitent, who now, ere Phoebus mounts the firmament, fondles the flower amid the sobbing rain. Keats. Whom the gods love die young. Truly it would seem so, as we read the old tales of men and of women beloved of the gods. To those men who were deemed worthy of being companions of the gods, seemingly no good fortune came. Yet, after all, in even a brief span of life, they had tasted God-given happiness. Was their fate one to be pitied? Rather let us keep our tears for those who, in a colourless grey world, have seen the dull days go past, laden with trifling duties, unnecessary cares, and ever-narrowing ideals, and have reached old age and the grave, no narrower than their lives, without ever having known a fullness of happiness, such as the Olympians knew, or ever having dared to reach upwards, and to hold fellowship with the immortals. Hyacinthus was a Spartan youth, son of Clio, one of the Muses, and of the mortal with whom she had mated, and from mother or father, or from the gods themselves, he had received the gift of beauty. It chanced one day that as Apollo drove his chariot on its all-conquering round, he saw the boy. Hyacinthus was as fair to look upon as the fairest of women, yet he was not only full of grace, but was muscular and strong as a straight young pine on Mount Olympus, that fears not the blind rage of the north wind, nor the angry tempests of the south. When Apollo had spoken with him, he found that the face of Hyacinthus did not belie the heart within him, and gladly the god felt that at last he had found the perfect companion, the ever-courageous and joyous young mate, whose mood was always ready to meet his own. Did Apollo desire to hunt? With merry shout Hyacinthus called the hounds. Did the great god deign to fish? Hyacinthus was ready to fetch the nets, and to throw himself, whole-souled, into the great affair of chasing and of landing the silvery fishes. When Apollo wished to climb the mountains, to heights so lonely that not even the moving of an eagle's wing broke the everlasting stillness, Hyacinthus, his strong limbs too perfect for the chisel of any sculptor worthily to reproduce, was ready and eager for the climb. And when on the mountain top Apollo gazed in silence over illimitable space, and watched the silver car of his sister Diana rising slowly into the deep blue of the sky, silvering land and water as she passed, it was never Hyacinthus who was the first to speak, with words to break the spell of nature's perfect beauty, shared in perfect companionship. There were times, too, when Apollo would play his lyre, and when naught but the music of his own making could fulfill his longing. And when those times came, Hyacinthus would lie at the feet of his friend, of the friend who was a god, and would listen, with eyes of rapturous joy, to the music that his master made. A very perfect friend was this friend of the sun god. Nor was it Apollo alone who desired the friendship of Hyacinthus. Zephyrus, god of the south wind, had known him before Apollo crossed his path, and had eagerly desired him for a friend. But who could stand against Apollo? Sulkily Zephyrus marked their ever-ripening friendship, and in his heart jealousy grew into hatred, and hatred whispered to him of revenge. Hyacinthus excelled at all sports, and when he played quoits it was sheer joy for Apollo, who loved all things beautiful, to watch him as he stood to throw the disc, his taut muscles making him look like Hermes, ready to spurn the cumbering earth from off his feet. Further even than the god, his friend, could Hyacinthus throw, and always his merry laugh when he succeeded made the god feel that nor man nor god could ever grow old. And so there came that day, foreordained by the fates, when Apollo and Hyacinthus played a match together. Hyacinthus made a valiant throw, and Apollo took his place and cast the discus high and far. Hyacinthus ran forward, eager to measure the distance, shouting with excitement over a throw that had indeed been worthy of a god. Thus did Zephyrus gain his opportunity. Swiftly through the tree-tops ran the murmuring south wind, and smote the discus of Apollo with a cruel hand. Against the forehead of Hyacinthus it dashed, smiting the locks that lay upon it, crashing through skin and flesh and bone, felling him to the earth. Apollo ran towards him and raised him in his arms, but the head of Hyacinthus fell over on the god's shoulder, like the head of a lily whose stem is broken. The red blood gushed to the ground, an unquenchable stream, and darkness fell on the eyes of Hyacinthus, and, with the flow of his life's blood, his gallant young soul passed away. Would that I could die for thee, Hyacinthus, cried the god, his god's heart near breaking. I have robbed thee of thy youth. Thine is the suffering, mine the crime. I shall sing thee ever, O perfect friend, and evermore shalt thou live as a flower that will speak to the hearts of men of spring, of everlasting youth, of life that lives forever. As he spoke, there sprang from the blood drops at his feet a cluster of flowers, blue as the sky in spring, yet hanging their heads as if in sorrow. And still, when winter is ended, and the songbirds tell us of the promise of spring, if we go to the woods, we find traces of the vow of the sun god. The trees are budding in buds of rosy hue. The willow branches are decked with silvery catkins powdered with gold. The larches, like slender dryads, wear a feathery garb of tender green, and under the trees of the woods the primrose look up like fallen stars. Along the woodland path we go, treading on fragrant pine needles and on the beech leaves of last year that have not yet lost their radiant amber. And at a turn of the way the sun god suddenly shines through the great dark branches of the giants of the forest, and before us lies a patch of exquisite blue, as though a god had robbed the sky and torn from it a precious fragment that seems alive and moving between the sun and the shadow. And as we look, the sun caresses it, and the south wind gently moves the little bell-shaped flowers of the wild hyacinth as it softly sweeps across them. So does Hyacinthus live on, so do Apollo and Zephyrus still love and mourn their friend. End of Hyacinthus by Jean Lang.
The Oahu Legends of Maui. From Legends of Maui, a demigod of Polynesia, and of his mother Hina, by W. D. Westervelt. Several Maui legends have been located on the island of Oahu. They were given by Mr. Kaya to Mr. T. G. Thrum, the publisher of what is well known in the Hawaiian Islands as Thrum's Annual. He has kindly furnished them for added interest to the present volume. The legends have a distinctly local flavor, confined entirely to Oahu. It has seemed best to reserve them for a chapter by themselves, although they are chiefly variations of stories already told. Maui and the Two Gods. This history of Maui and his grandmother Hina begins with their arrival from foreign lands. They dwelt in Kaneana, Kane's cave, Waianae, Oahu. This is an ana, or cave, at Pu'uahulu. Hina had wonderful skill in making all kinds of tapa, according to the custom of the woman of ancient Hawaii. Maui went to the Ko'olau side and rested at Kahalu'u, a diving place in Ko'olaupoko. In that place, there is a noted hill called Ma'eli'eli. This is the story of that hill. Maui threw up a pile of dirt and concealed rubbish under it. The two gods, Kane and Kanaloa, came along and asked Maui what he was doing. He said, "What you see. You two dig on that side to the foot of the pali, precipice, and I will go down at Kahalu'u. If you two dig through first, you may kill me. If I get through first, I will kill you." They agreed and began to dig and throw up the dirt. Then Maui dug 3 times and tossed up some of the hills of that place. Kane and Kanaloa saw that Maui was digging very fast, so they put forth very great strength and threw the dirt into a hill. Meanwhile, Maui ran away to the other side of the island. Thus, by the aid of the gods, the hill Ma'eli'eli was thrown up and received its name Eli, meaning dig. Ma'eli'eli meant the place of digging. How they found fire. It was said that Maui and Hina had no fire. They were often cold and had no cooked food. Maui saw flames rising in a distant place and ran to see how they were made. When he came to that place, the fire was out and some birds flew away. One of them was Ka'alae Huapi, the stingy alae, a small duck, the Hawaiian mud hen. Maui watched again, and saw fire. When he went up, the bird saw him coming and scattered the fire, carrying the ashes into the water, but he leaped and caught the little alae. "Ah," he said, "I will kill you because you do not let me have fire." The bird replied, "If you kill me, you cannot find fire." Maui said, "Where is fire?" The alae said, "Go up on the high land where beautiful plants with large leaves are standing. Rub their branches." Maui set the bird free and went inland from Halawa and found dry land taro. He began to rub the stalks, but only juice came out like water. He had no red fire. He was very angry and said, "If that lying alae is caught again by me, I will be its death." After a while, he saw the fire burning and ran swiftly. The bird saw him and cried, "The cooking is over. Here comes the swift grandchild of Hina." They scattered the fire, threw the ashes away, and flew into the water. But again, Maui caught the alae and began to kill it, saying, "You gave me a plant full of water from which to get fire." The bird said, "If I die, you can never find fire. I will give you the secret of fire. Take a branch of that dry tree and rub." Maui held the bird fast in one hand while he rubbed the other until smoke and fire came out. Then he took the fire stick and rubbed the head of the bird, making a place where red and white feathers have grown ever since. He returned to Hina and taught her how to make fire, using the 2 fire sticks, and how to twist coconut fiber to catch the fire when it had been kindled in wood. But the alae was not forgotten. It was called huapi, stingy, because it selfishly kept the knowledge of fire-making to itself. Maui catching the sun. Maui watched Hina making tapa. The wet tapa was spread on a long tapa board, and Hina began at one end to pound it into shape, pounding from one end to another. He noticed that sunset came by the time she had pounded to the middle of the board. The sun hurried so fast that she could only begin her work before the day was past. He went to the hill Haleakala, which means journey of the sun. He thought he would catch the sun and make it move slowly. He went up the hill and waited. When the sun began to rise, Maui made himself long, stretching up toward the sky. Soon, the shining legs of the sun came up the hillside. He saw Maui and began to run swiftly, but Maui reached out and caught one of the legs, saying, "Oh, sun, I will kill you. You are a mischief maker. You make trouble for Hina by going so fast." Then he broke the shining leg of the sun. The sufferer said, "I will change my way and go slowly, 6 months slow and 6 months faster." Thus arose the saying, "Long shall be the daily journey of the sun, and he shall give light for all the people's toil." Hina learned that she could pound until she was tired, while the farmers could plant and take care of their fields. Thus, also this hill received its name, Haleakala. This is one of the hills of Waianae, near the precipice of the hill Pu'uohulu. Uniting the islands. Maui suggested to Hina that he had better try to draw the islands together, uniting them in one land. Hina told Maui to go and see Alae Nuia Hina, who would tell him what to do. The Alae told him they must go to Ponaha Ke'one, a fishing place outside of Pearl Harbor, and find Kauniho Kahi, the one tooth, who held the land under the sea. Maui went back to Hina. She told him to ask his brothers to go fishing with him. They consented and pushed out into the sea. Soon, Maui saw a bailing dish floating by the canoe and picked it up. It was named Hina Akeka, Hina who fell off. They paddled to Ponaha Ke'one. When they stopped, they saw a beautiful young woman in the boat. Then they anchored and again looked in the boat, but the young woman was gone. They saw the bailing dish and threw it into the sea. Maui Mua threw his hook and caught a large fish, which was seen to be a shark as they drew it to the surface. At once they cut the line, so also Maui Hope and Maui Waina. At last, Maui threw his hook, Manai Kalani, into the sea. It went down, down into the depths. Maui cried, "Hina Akeka has my hook in her hand. By her it will be made fast." Hina went down with the hook until she met Kauniho Kahi. She asked him to open his mouth, then threw the hook far inside and made it fast. Then she pulled the line so that Maui should know that the fish was caught. Maui fastened the line to the outrigger of the canoe and asked his brothers to paddle with all diligence and not look back. Long they paddled and were very tired. Then Maui took a paddle and dipped deep into the sea. The boat moved more swiftly through the sea. The brothers looked back and cried, "There is plenty of land behind us." The charm was broken. The hook came out of the one tooth, and the raised islands sank back into their place. The natives say the islands are now united to America. Perhaps Maui has been at work. Maui and Peapea the Eight-Eyed. Maui had been fishing and had caught a great fish upon which he was feasting. He looked inland and saw his wife Kumulama seized and carried away by Peapea Makawalu, Peapea the Eight-Eyed. This is a legend derived from the myths of many islands in which Lupe, or Rupe, pigeon, changed himself into a bird and flew after his sister Hina, who had been carried on the back of a shark to distant islands. Sometimes as a man and sometimes as a bird, he prosecuted his search until Hina was found. Maui pursued Peapea, but could not catch him. He carried Maui's wife over the sea to a far-away island. Maui was greatly troubled, but his grandmother sent him inland to find an old man who would tell him what to do. Maui went inland and, looking down toward Waipahu, saw this man, Ku'olokele. He was humpbacked. Maui threw a large stone and hit the hill on the back, knocked it off, and made the back straight. The old man lifted up the stone and threw it to Waipahu, where it lies to this day. Then he and Maui walked together. He told Maui to go and catch birds and gather tea leaves and fibers of the ie vine and fill his house. These things Maui secured and brought to him. He told Maui to go home and return after 3 days. Ku'olokele took the tea leaves and the ie threads and made the body of a great bird, which he covered with bird feathers. He fastened all together with the ie. This was done in the first day. The second day he placed food inside and tried his bird, and it flew all right. Thus, as the Hawaiians say, the first flying ship was made in the time of Maui. This is a modern version of Rupe changing himself into a bird. On the third day, Maui came and saw the wonderful bird body thoroughly prepared for his journey. Maui went inside. Ku'olokele said, "When you reach that land, look for a village. If the people are not there, look to the beach. If there are many people, your wife and Peapea the Eight-Eyed will be there. Do not go near, but fly out over the sea. The people will say, 'Oh, the strange bird,' but Peapea will say, 'This is my bird. It is taboo.' You can then come to the people." Maui pulled the ie ropes fastened to the wings and made them move. Thus he flew away into the sky. 2 days was his journey before he came to that strange island, Moana Liha I Kawa'okele. It was a beautiful island. He flew inland to a village, but there were no people, according to the ancient chant. The houses of Limaloa stand, but there are no people. They are at Mana. The people were by the sea. Maui flew over them. He saw his wife, but he passed on flying out over the sea, skimming like a seabird down to the water and rising gracefully up to the sky. Peapea called out, "This is my bird. It is taboo." Maui heard and came to the beach. He was caught and placed in a taboo box. The servants carried him up to the village and put him in the chief's sleeping house when Peapea and his people returned to their homes. In the night, Peapea and Maui's wife lay down to sleep. Maui watched Peapea, hoping that he would soon sleep. Then he would kill him. Maui waited. 1 eye was closed, 7 eyes were opened. Then 4 eyes were closed, leaving 3. The night was almost past and dawn was near. Then Maui called to Hina with his spirit voice. "Oh, Hina, keep it dark." Hina made the gray dawn dark in the 3 eyes, and 2 closed in sleep. The last eye was wary, and it also slept. Then Maui went out of the bird body and cut off the head of Peapea and put it inside the bird. He broke the roof of the house until a large opening was made. He took his wife, Kumulama, and flew away to the island of Oahu. The winds blew hard against the flying bird. Rain fell in torrents around it, but those inside had no trouble. Thus Maui returned with his wife to his home in Oahu. The story is Pau. Finished. End of the Oahu Legends of Maui from Legends of Maui, a demigod of Polynesia and of his mother Hina, by W.D. Westervelt.
Pegasus, the Winged Horse, by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Once, in the old times, a fountain gushed out of a hillside in the marvelous land of Greece. And, for aught I know, after so many 1,000 years, it is still gushing out of the very self-same spot. At any rate, there was the pleasant fountain, welling freshly forth and sparkling adown the hillside in the golden sunset, when a handsome young man named Bellerophon drew near its margin. In his hand he held a bridle studded with brilliant gems and adorned with a golden bit. Seeing an old man and another of middle age, and a little boy near the fountain, and likewise a maiden who was dripping up some of the water in a pitcher, he paused and begged that he might refresh himself with a draught. "This is very delicious water," he said to the maiden as he rinsed and filled her pitcher, after drinking out of it. "Will you be kind enough to tell me whether the fountain has any name?" "Yes, it is called the Fountain of Pirene," answered the maiden, and then she added, "My grandmother has told me that this clear fountain was once a beautiful woman, and when her son was killed by the arrows of the huntress Diana, she melted all away into tears, and so the water, which you find so cool and refreshing, is the sorrow of that poor mother's heart." "I should not have dreamed," observed the young stranger, "that so clear a wellspring, with its gush and gurgle, and its cheery dance out of the shade into the sunlight, had so much as one teardrop in its bosom. And this, then, is Pirene? I thank you, pretty maiden, for telling me its name. I have come from a faraway country to find this very spot." A middle-aged country fellow, he had driven his cow to drink out of the spring, stared hard at young Bellerophon, and at the handsome bridle which he carried in his hand. "The water courses must be getting low, friend, in your part of the world," remarked he, "if you come so far only to find the Fountain of Pirene. But pray, have you lost a horse? I see you carry the bridle in your hand, and a very pretty one it is with that double row of bright stones upon it. If the horse was as fine as the bridle, you are much to be pitied for losing him." "I have lost no horse," said Bellerophon with a smile, "but I happen to be seeking a very famous one, which, as wise people have informed me, must be found hereabouts, if anywhere. Do you know whether the winged horse Pegasus still haunts the Fountain of Pirene, as he used to do in your forefathers' days?" But then the country fellow laughed. "Some of you, my little friends, have probably heard that this Pegasus was a snow-white steed with beautiful silvery wings, who spent most of his time on the summit of Mount Helicon. He was as wild and as swift and as buoyant in his flight through the air as any eagle that ever soared into the clouds, There was nothing else like him in the world. He had no mate. He had never been backed or bridled by a master. And for many a long year he led a solitary and happy life. Oh, how fine a thing it is to be a winged horse, sleeping at night, as he did, on a lofty mountain-top, and passing the greater part of the day in the air. Pegasus seemed hardly to be a creature of the earth. Whenever he was seen, up very high above people's heads, with the sunshine on his silvery wings, you would have thought that he belonged to the sky, and that, skimming a little too low, he had got astray among our mists and vapors, and was seeking his way back again. It was very pretty to behold him plunge into the fleecy bosom of a bright cloud and be lost in it, for a moment or two, and then break forth from the other side. Or, in a sullen rainstorm, when there was a grey pavement of clouds over the whole sky, it would sometimes happen that the winged horse descended right through it, and the glad light of the upper region would gleam after him. In another instant, it is true, both Pegasus and the pleasant light would be gone away together. But anyone that was fortunate enough to see this wondrous spectacle felt cheerful the whole day afterward, and as much longer as the storm lasted. In the summertime and in the beautifulest of weather, Pegasus often alighted on the solid earth, and, closing his silvery wings, would gallop over hill and dale for pastimes as fleetly as the wind. Oftener than in any other place, he had been seen near the fountain of Pyrene, drinking the delicious water, or rolling himself upon the soft grass of the margin. Sometimes, too, but Pegasus was very dainty in his food. He would crop a few of the clover blossoms that happened to be sweetest. To the fountain of Pyrene, therefore, people's great-grandfathers had been in the habit of going, as long as they were youthful and retained their faith in winged horses, in hopes of getting a glimpse at the beautiful Pegasus. But of late years he had been very seldom seen. Indeed, there were many of the country folk, dwelling within half an hour's walk of the fountain, who had never beheld Pegasus, and did not believe that there was any such creature in existence. The country fellow to whom Bellerophon was speaking chanced to be one of those incredulous persons. And that was the reason why he laughed. "Pegasus, indeed," cried he, turning up his nose as high as such a flat nose could be turned up. "Pegasus, indeed. A winged horse, truly. Why, friend, are you in your senses? Of what use would wings be to a horse? Could he drag the plough so well, think you? To be sure, there might be a little saving in the expense of shoes, but then how would a man like to see his horse flying out of the stable window? Yes, or whisking him up above the clouds, when he only wanted to ride to the mill? No, I don't believe in Pegasus. There never was such a ridiculous kind of horse-fowl made." "I have some reason to think otherwise," said Bellerophon, quietly. And then he turned to an old grey man, who was leaning on a staff and listening very attentively, with his head stretched forward and one hand at his ear, because, for the last 20 years, he had been getting rather deaf. "And what say you, venerable sir?" inquired he. "In your younger days, I should imagine, you must have frequently seen the winged steed." "Ah, young stranger, my memory is very poor," said the aged man. "When I was a lad, if I remember rightly, I used to believe that there was such a horse, and so did everybody else. But nowadays I hardly know what to think, and very seldom think about the winged horse at all. If I ever saw the creature, it was a long, long while ago, and to tell you the truth, I doubt whether I ever did see him. One day, to be sure, when I was quite a youth, I remember seeing some hoof tramps around the brink of the fountain. Pegasus might have made those hoof marks, and so might have some other horse." "And have you never seen him, my fair maiden?" asked Bellerophon of the girl, who stood with a pitcher on her head while this talk went on. "You certainly could see Pegasus, if anybody can, for your eyes are very bright." "Once I thought I saw him," replied the maiden, with a smile and a blush. "It was either Pegasus or a large white bird, a very great way up in the air. And one other time, as I was coming to the fountain with my pitcher, I heard a neigh. Oh, such a brisk and melodious neigh as that was! My very heart leapt with delight at the sound. But it startled me, nevertheless, so that I ran home without filling my pitcher." "That was truly a pity," said Bellerophon. And he turned to the child, whom I mentioned at the beginning of the story, and who was gazing at him, as children are apt to gaze at strangers, with his rosy mouth open wide. "Well, my little fellow," cried Bellerophon, playfully pulling one of his curls, "I suppose you have often seen the winged horse." "That I have," answered the child, very readily. "I saw him yesterday, and many times before." "You are a fine little man," said Bellerophon, drawing the child closer to him. "Come, tell me all about it." "Why," replied the child, "I often come here to sail little boats in the fountain, and to gather pretty pebbles out of its basin. And sometimes, when I look down into the water, I see the image of the winged horse, in the picture of the sky that is there. I wish he would come down and take me on his back, and let me ride him up to the moon. But if I so much as stir to look at him, he flies far away out of sight." And Bellerophon put his faith in the child, who had seen the image of Pegasus in the water, and in the maiden who had heard him neigh so melodiously, rather than in the middle-aged clown, who believed only in cart horses, or in the old man who had forgotten the beautiful things of his youth. Therefore he haunted about the fountain of Pirene for a great many days afterwards. He kept continually on the watch, looking upward at the sky, or else down in the water, hoping forever that he should either see the reflected image of the winged horse, or the marvelous reality itself. He held the bridle, with its bright gems and golden bit, always ready in his hand. The rustic people who dwelt in the neighborhood, and drove their cattle to the fountain to drink, would often laugh at poor Bellerophon, and sometimes take him pretty severely to task. They told him that an able-bodied young man like himself ought to have better business than to be wasting his time in such idle pursuit. They offered to sell him a horse, if he wanted one, and when Bellerophon declined the purchase, they tried to drive a bargain with him for his fine bridle. Even the country boys thought him so very foolish that they used to have a great deal of sport about him, and were rude enough not to care a fig, although Bellerophon saw and heard it. One little urchin, for example, would play Pegasus, and cut the oddest imaginable capers by way of flying, while one of his schoolfellows would scamper after him, holding forth a twist of bulrushes, which was intended to represent Bellerophon's ornamental bridle. But the gentle child, who had seen the picture of Pegasus in the water, comforted the young stranger more than all the naughty boys could torment him. The dear little fellow, in his play hours, often sat down beside him, and, without speaking a word, would look down into the fountain and up towards the sky, with so innocent a faith that Bellerophon could not help feeling encouraged. Now you will, perhaps, wish to be told why it was that Bellerophon had undertaken to catch the winged horse, and we shall find no better opportunity to speak about this matter than while he is waiting for Pegasus to appear. If I were to relate the whole of Bellerophon's previous adventures, they might easily grow into a very long story. It will be quite enough to say that, in a certain country in Asia, a terrible monster called a chimera had made its appearance, and was doing more mischief than could be talked about between now and sunset. According to the best accounts which I have been able to obtain, this chimera was nearly, if not quite, the ugliest and most poisonous creature, and the strangest and unaccountablest, and the hardest to fight with, and the most difficult to run away from, that ever came out of the earth's inside. It had a tail like a boa constrictor. Its body was like I do not care what, and it had 3 separate heads. one of which was a lion's, the second a goat's, and the third an abominably great snake's. And a hot blast of fire came flaming out each of its 3 mouths. Being an earthly monster, I doubt whether it had any wings. But, wings or no, it ran like a goat and a lion, and wriggled along like a serpent, and thus contrived to make about as much speed as all 3 together. Oh, the mischief and mischief and mischief that this naughty creature did! With its flaming breath it could set a forest on fire, or burn up a field of grain, or, for that matter, a village with all its fences and houses. It laid waste the whole country about, and used to eat up people and animals alive, and cook them afterward in the burning oven of its stomach. Mercy on us, little children. I hope neither you nor I will ever happen to meet a chimera. While the hateful beast, if a beast we can anywise call it, was doing all these horrible things, it so chanced that Bellerophon came to that part of the world, on a visit to the king. The king's name was Iobates, and Lycia was the country he ruled over. Bellerophon was one of the bravest youths in the world, and desired nothing so much as to do some valiant and beneficent deed, such as would make all mankind admire and love him. In those days, the only way for a young man to distinguish himself was by fighting battles, either with the enemies of his country, or with wicked giants, or with troublesome dragons, or with wild beasts, when he could find nothing more dangerous to encounter. King Iobates perceived the courage of his youthful visitor, proposed him to go and fight the chimera, which everybody else was afraid of, and which, unless it should soon be killed, was likely to convert Lycia into a desert. Bellerophon hesitated not a moment, but assured the king that he would either slay this dreadful chimera or perish in the attempt. But, in the first place, as the monster was so prodigiously swift, he bethought himself that he should never win the victory by fighting on foot. The wisest thing he could do, therefore, was to get the very best and fleetest horse that could anywhere be found. And what other horse, in all the world, was half so fleet as the marvelous horse Pegasus, who had wings as well as legs, and was even more active in the air than on the earth? To be sure, a great many people denied that there was any such horse with wings, and said that the stories about him were all poetry and nonsense. But, wonderful as it appeared, Bellerophon believed that Pegasus was a real steed, and hoped that he himself might be fortunate enough to find him, and, once fairly mounted on his back, he would be able to fight the chimera at better advantage. And this was the purpose with which he had traveled from Lycia to Greece, and had brought the beautifully ornamental bridle in his hand. It was an enchanted bridle. If he could only succeed in putting the golden bit into the mouth of Pegasus, the winged horse would be submissive, and would own Bellerophon for his master, and fly whithersoever he might choose to turn the rein. But indeed, it was a weary and anxious time, while Bellerophon waited and waited for Pegasus, in hopes that he would come and drink at the fountain of Pirene. He was afraid lest King Iobates should imagine that he had fled from the chimera. It pained him, too, to think how much mischief the monster was doing, while he himself, instead of fighting with it, was compelled to sit idly poring over the bright waters of Pirene as they gushed out of the sparkling sand. And as Pegasus came thither so seldom in these latter years, and scarcely alighted there more than once in a lifetime, Bellerophon feared that he might grow an old man, and have no strength left in his arms, nor courage in his heart, before the winged horse would appear. Oh, how heavily passes the time, while an adventurous youth is yearning to do his part in life, and to gather in the harvest of his renown. How hard a lesson it is to wait. Our life is brief, and how much of it is spent in teaching us only this? Well was it for Bellerophon that the gentle child had grown so fond of him, and was never weary of keeping him company. Every morning the child gave him a new hope to put in his bosom, instead of yesterday's withered one. "Dear Bellerophon," he would cry, looking up hopefully into his face. "I think we shall see Pegasus today." And, at length, if it had not been for the little boy's unwavering faith, Bellerophon would have given up all hope, and would have gone back to Lycia and done his best to slay the chimera without the help of the winged horse. And in that case, poor Bellerophon would at least have been terribly scorched by the creature's breath, and would most probably have been killed and devoured. Nobody should ever try to fight an earth-born chimera, unless he can first get upon the back of an aerial steed. One morning, the child spoke to Bellerophon even more hopefully than usual. "Dear, dear Bellerophon," cried he, "I know not why it is, but I feel as if we should certainly see Pegasus today." And all that day he would not stir a step from Bellerophon's side, so they ate a crust of bread together and drank some of the water of the fountain. In the afternoon, there they sat, and Bellerophon had thrown his arm around the child, who likewise had put one of his little hands into Bellerophon's. The latter was lost in his own thoughts, and was fixing his eyes vacantly on the trunks of the trees that overshadowed the fountain, and on the grapevines that clambered up their branches. But the gentle child was gazing down into the water. He was grieved for Bellerophon's sake, and that the hope of another day should be deceived, like so many before it, and 2 or 3 quiet teardrops fell from his eye, and mingled with what were said to be the many tears of Pyrene, when she wept for her slain children. But when he least thought of it, Bellerophon felt the pressure of the child's little hand, and heard a soft, almost breathless whisper. "See there, dear Bellerophon, there is an image in the water." The young man looked down into the dimpling mirror of the fountain, and saw what he took to be the reflection of a bird, which seemed to be flying at a great height in the air, with a gleam of sunshine on its snowy or silvery wings. "What a splendid bird it must be," said he, "and how very large it looks, though it must really be flying higher than the clouds." "It makes me tremble," whispered the child. "I am afraid to look up into the air. It is very beautiful, and yet I dare only look at its image in the water. Dear Bellerophon, do you not see that it is no bird? It is the winged horse Pegasus." Bellerophon's heart began to throb. He gazed keenly upward, but could not see the winged creature, whether bird or horse, because just then it had plunged into the fleecy depths of a summer cloud. It was but a moment, however, before the object reappeared, sinking lightly down out of the cloud, though still at a vast distance from the earth. Bellerophon caught the child in his arms and shrank back with him, so that they were both hidden among the thick shrubbery which grew all around the fountain. Not that he was afraid of any harm, but he dreaded lest, if Pegasus caught a glimpse of them, he would fly far away and alight in some inaccessible mountaintop. For it really was the winged horse. After they had expected him so long, he was coming to quench his thirst with the water of Pyrene. Nearer and nearer came the aerial wonder, flying in great circles, as you may have seen a dove when about to alight. Downward came Pegasus in those wide, sweeping circles, which grew narrower and narrower still as he gradually approached the earth. The nigher the view of him, the more beautiful he was, and the more marvelous the sweep of his silvery wings. At last, with so light a pressure as to hardly bend the grass about the fountain, or imprint a hoof tramp in the sand of its margin, he alighted, and, stooping his wild head, began to drink. He drew in the water with long and pleasant sighs, and tranquil pauses of enjoyment, and then another draught, and another, and another. For nowhere in the world, or up among the clouds, did Pegasus love any water as he loved this of Pyrene, and when his thirst was slaked, he cropped a few of the honey blossoms of the clover, delicately tasting them, but not caring to make a hearty meal, because the herbage, just beneath the clouds, on the lofty sides of Mount Helicon suited his palate better than this ordinary grass. After thus drinking to his heart's content, and in his dainty fashion, condescending to take a little food, the winged horse began to caper to and fro, and dance, as it were, out of mere idleness and sport. There never was a more playful creature made than this Pegasus. So there he frisked, in a way that it delights me to think about, fluttering his great wings as lightly as ever did a linnet, and running little races, half on earth and half in the air, and which I know not whether to call a flight or a gallop. When a creature is perfectly able to fly, he sometimes chooses to run, just for the pastime of the thing. And so did Pegasus, although it cost him some little trouble to keep his hooves so near the ground. Bellerophon, meanwhile, holding the child's hand, peeped forth from the shrubbery, and thought that never was any sight so beautiful as this, nor ever a horse's eyes so wild and spirited as those of Pegasus. It seemed a sin to think of bridling him and riding on his back. Once or twice, Pegasus stopped and snuffed the air, pricking up his ears, tossing his head, and turning it on all sides, as if he partly suspected some mischief or other. Seeing nothing, however, and hearing no sound, he soon began his antics again. At length, not that he was weary, but only idle and luxurious, Pegasus folded his wings and lay down on the soft green turf. But, being too full of aerial life to remain quiet for many moments together, he soon rolled over on his back, with his 4 slender legs in the air. It was beautiful to see him, this one solitary creature, whose mate had never been created, but who needed no companion, and, living a great many 100 years, was as happy as the centuries were long. The more he did such things as mortal horses are accustomed to, the less earthly and the more wonderful he seemed. Bellerophon and the child almost held their breath, partly from a delightful awe, but still more because they dreaded lest the slight stir or murmur should send him up, with the speed of an arrow flight, into the furthest blue of the sky. Finally, when he had had enough of rolling over and over, Pegasus turned himself about, and, indolently, like any other horse, put out his foreleg in order to rise from the ground, and Bellerophon, who guessed that he would do so, darted suddenly from the thicket and leapt astride of his back. Yes, there he sat, on the back of the winged horse. But what a bound did Pegasus make when, for the first time, he felt the weight of a mortal man upon his loins. A bound indeed. Before he had time to draw a breath, Bellerophon found himself 500 feet aloft, and still shooting upward, while the winged horse snorted and trembled with terror and anger. Up he went, up, 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 until he plunged into the cold, misty bosom of a cloud, at which, only a little while before, Bellerophon had been gazing and fancying it a very pleasant spot. Then again, out of the heart of the cloud, Pegasus shot down like a thunderbolt, as if he meant to dash both himself and his rider headlong against a rock. Then he went through about 1,000 of the wildest caprioles that have ever been performed, either by a bird or a horse. I cannot tell you half that he did. He skimmed straight forward, and sidewise, and backward. He reared himself erect, with his 4 legs on a wreath of mist, and his hind legs on nothing at all. He flung out his heels behind, and put down his head between his legs, with his wings pointing right upward. At about 2 miles' height above the earth, he turned a somersault, so that Bellerophon's heels were up where his head should have been, and he seemed to look down into the sky instead of up. He twisted his head about, and looking Bellerophon in the face, with fire flashing from his eyes, made a terrible attempt to bite him. He fluttered his pinions so wildly that one of the silver feathers was shaken out, and, floating earthward, was picked up by the child, who kept it as long as he lived, in memory of Pegasus and Bellerophon. But the latter, who, as you may judge, was as good a horseman as ever galloped, had been watching his opportunity, and at last clapped the golden bit of the enchanted bridle between the winged steed's jaws. No sooner was this done than Pegasus became as manageable as if he had taken food all his life out of Bellerophon's hand. To speak what I really feel, it was almost a sadness to see so wild a creature grow suddenly so tame. And Pegasus seemed to feel it so, likewise. He looked round to Bellerophon, with the tears in his beautiful eyes, instead of the fire that had so recently flashed from them. But when Bellerophon patted his head and spoke a few authoritative, yet kind and soothing words, another look came into the eyes of Pegasus, for he was glad at heart, after so many lonely centuries, to have found a companion and a master. Thus it always is with winged horses, and with all such wild and solitary creatures. If you can catch and overcome them, it is the surest way to win their love. While Pegasus had been doing his utmost to shake Bellerophon off his back, he had flown a very long distance. They had come within sight of the lofty mountain by the time the bit was in his mouth. Bellerophon had seen this mountain before, and knew it to be Helicon, on the summit of which was the winged horse's abode. Thither, after looking gently into the rider's face, as if to ask leave, Pegasus now flew, and, alighting, waited patiently until Bellerophon should please to dismount. The young man, accordingly, leaped from his steed's back, but still held him fast by the bridle. Meeting his eyes, however, he was so affected by the gentleness of his aspect, and by the thought of the free life which Pegasus had heretofore lived, that he could not bear to keep him a prisoner, if he really desired his liberty. Obeying this generous impulse, he slipped the enchanted bridle off the head of Pegasus, and took the bit from his mouth. "Leave me, Pegasus," said he. "Either leave me or love me." In an instant the winged horse shot almost out of sight, soaring straight upward from the summit of Mount Helicon. Being long after sunset, it was now twilight on the mountain top, and dusky evening over all the country round about it. But Pegasus flew so high that he overtook the departed day, and was bathed in the upper radiance of the sun. Ascending higher and higher, he looked a bright speck, and at last could no longer be seen in the hollow waste of the sky. And Bellerophon was afraid that he should never behold him any more. But, while he was lamenting his own folly, the bright speck reappeared, and drew nearer and nearer, until it descended lower than the sunshine. And behold, Pegasus had come back. After this trial, there was no more fear of the winged horse making his escape. He and Bellerophon were friends, and put loving faith in one another. That night they lay down and slept together, with Bellerophon's arm about the neck of Pegasus, not as a caution, but for kindness. And they awoke at peep of day, and bade one another good morning, each in his own language. In this manner, Bellerophon and the wonderful steed spent several days, and grew better and better acquainted, and fonder of each other all the time. They went on long aerial journeys, and sometimes ascended so high that the earth looked hardly bigger than the moon. They visited distant countries and amazed the inhabitants, who thought that the beautiful young man on the back of the winged horse must have come down out of the sky. 1,000 miles a day was no more than an easy space for the fleet Pegasus to pass over. Bellerophon was delighted with this kind of life, and would have liked nothing better than to live always in the same way, aloft in the clear atmosphere, for it was always sunny weather up there, however cheerless and rainy it might be in the lower region. But he could not forget the horrible chimera, which he had promised King Iobates to slay. So, at last, when he had become well accustomed to feats of horsemanship in the air, and could manage Pegasus with the least motion of his hand, and had taught him to obey his voice, he determined to attempt the performance of this perilous adventure. At daybreak, therefore, as soon as he unclosed his eyes, he gently pinched the winged horse's ear in order to arouse him. Pegasus immediately started from the ground and pranced about 1/4 mile aloft and made a grand sweep around the mountaintop, by way of showing that he was wide awake and ready for any kind of excursion. During the whole of this little flight, he uttered a loud, brisk, and melodious neigh, and finally came down at Bellerophon's side, as lightly as ever you saw a sparrow hop upon a twig. "Well done, dear Pegasus! Well done, my sky skimmer!" cried Bellerophon fondly, stroking the horse's neck. "And now, my fleet and beautiful friend, we must break our fast. Today we are to fight the terrible Chimera." As soon as they had eaten their morning meal and drank some sparkling water from a spring called Hippocrene, Pegasus held out his head of his own accord so that his master might put on the bridle. Then, with a great many playful leaps and airy caperings, he showed his impatience to be gone, while Bellerophon was girding on his sword and hanging his shield about his neck and preparing himself for battle. When everything was ready, the rider mounted and, as was his custom when going a long distance, ascended 5 miles perpendicularly, so as the better to see whither he was directing his course. He then turned the head of Pegasus toward the east and set out for Lycia. In their flight they overtook an eagle and came so nigh him before he could get out of their way that Bellerophon might easily have caught him by the leg. Hastening onward at this rate, it was still early in the forenoon when they beheld the lofty mountains of Lycia, with their deep and shaggy valleys. If Bellerophon had been told truly, it was in one of those dismal valleys that the hideous Chimera had taken up its abode. Being now so near their journey's end, the winged horse gradually descended with his rider, and they took advantage of some clouds that were floating over the mountaintops in order to conceal themselves. Hovering on the upper surface of a cloud, and peeping over its edge, Bellerophon had a pretty distinct view of the mountainous part of Lycia, and could look into all its shadowy vales at once. At first there appeared to be nothing remarkable. It was a wild, savage, and rocky tract of high and precipitous hills. In the more level part of the country, there were the ruins of houses that had been burned, and, here and there, the carcasses of dead cattle, strewn about the pastures where they had been feeding. The Chimera must have done this mischief, thought Bellerophon. But where can the monster be? As I have already said, there was nothing remarkable to be detected, at first sight, in any of the valleys and dells that lay among the precipitous heights of the mountains. Nothing at all, unless, indeed, it were 3 spires of black smoke, which issued from what seemed to be the mouth of a cavern, and clambered sullenly into the atmosphere. Before reaching the mountaintop, these 3 black smoke wreaths mingled themselves into one. The cavern was almost directly beneath the winged horse and his rider, at the distance of about 1,000 feet. The smoke, as it crept heavily upward, had an ugly, sulphurous, stifling scent, which caused Pegasus to snort and Bellerophon to sneeze. So disagreeable was it to the marvelous steed, who was accustomed to breathe only the purest air, that he waved his wings and shot 1/2 mile out of the range of this offensive vapor. But, on looking behind him, Bellerophon saw something that induced him first to draw the bridle, and then to turn Pegasus about. He made a sign which the winged horse understood, and sunk slowly through the air, until his hooves were scarcely more than a man's height above the rocky bottom of the valley. In front, as far off as you could throw a stone, was the cavern's mouth, with 3 smoke wreaths oozing out of it. And what else did Bellerophon behold there? There seemed to be a heap of strange and terrible creatures curled up within the cavern. Their bodies lay so close together that Bellerophon could not distinguish them apart, but, judging by their heads, one of these creatures was a huge snake, the second a fierce lion, and the third an ugly goat. The lion and the goat were asleep. The snake was broad awake and kept staring around him with a great pair of fiery eyes. But, and this was the most wonderful part of the matter, the 3 spires of smoke evidently issued from the nostrils of these 3 heads. So strange was the spectacle that, though Bellerophon had been all along expecting it, the truth did not immediately occur to him that here was the terrible 3-headed chimera. He had found the chimera's cavern. The snake, the lion, and the goat, as he supposed them to be, were not 3 separate creatures, but one monster. The wicked, hateful thing, slumbering as 2/3 of it were, it still held in its abominable claws the remnants of an unfortunate lamb, or possibly, but I hate to think it so, it was a dear little boy, which its 3 mouths had been gnawing before 2 of them fell asleep. All at once, Bellerophon started as if from a dream, and knew it to be the chimera. Pegasus seemed to know it at the same instant, and sent forth a neigh that sounded like the call of a trumpet to battle. At this sound, the 3 heads reared themselves erect, and belched out great flashes of flame. Before Bellerophon had time to consider what to do next, the monster flung itself out of the cavern and sprang straight towards him, with its immense claws extended and its snaky tail twisting itself venomously behind. If Pegasus had not been as nimble as a bird, both he and his rider would have been overthrown by the chimera's headlong rush, and thus the battle have ended before it was well begun. But the winged horse was not to be caught so. In the twinkling of an eye, he was up and aloft, halfway to the clouds, snorting with anger. He shuddered, too, not with fright, but with utter disgust at the loathsomeness of this poisonous thing with 3 heads. The chimera, on the other hand, raised itself up so as to stand absolutely on the tip end of its tail, with its talons pawing fiercely in the air, and its 3 heads sputtering fire at Pegasus and his rider. My stars, how it roared and hissed and bellowed! Bellerophon, meanwhile, was fitting his shield onto his arm and drawing his sword. "Now, my beloved Pegasus," he whispered into the winged horse's ear, "thou must help me to slay this insufferable monster, or else thou shalt fly back to thy solitary mountain peak without thy friend Bellerophon. For either the chimera dies, or its 3 mouths shall gnaw this head of mine, which has slumbered upon thy neck." Pegasus whinnied, and turning back his head, rubbed his nose tenderly against his rider's cheek. It was his way of telling him that, though he had wings and was an immortal horse, yet he would perish, if it were possible for immortality to perish, rather than leave Bellerophon behind. "I thank you, Pegasus," answered Bellerophon. "Now then, let us make a dash at the monster." Uttering these words, he shook the bridle, and Pegasus darted down aslant, as swift as the flight of an arrow, right towards the chimera's 3-fold head, which, all this time, was poking itself as high as it could into the air. As he came within arm's length, Bellerophon made a cut at the monster, but was carried onward by his steed before he could see whether the blow had been successful. Pegasus continued his course, but soon reeled round, at about the same distance from the chimera as before. Bellerophon then perceived that he had cut the goat's head almost off, so that it dangled downward by the skin and seemed quite dead. But to make amends, the snake's head and the lion's head had taken all the fierceness of the dead one into themselves, and spit flame, and hissed, and roared, with a vast deal more fury than before. "Never mind, my brave Pegasus," cried Bellerophon. "With another stroke like that, we will stop either its hissing or its roaring." And again he shook the bridle. Dashing aslantwise, as before, the winged horse made another arrow flight toward the chimera, and Bellerophon aimed another downward stroke at one of the 2 remaining heads, as he shot by. But this time, neither he nor Pegasus escaped so well as the first. With one of its claws, the chimera had given the young man a deep scratch in his shoulder, and had slightly damaged the left wing of the flying steed with the other. On his part, Bellerophon had mortally wounded the lion's head of the monster, insomuch that it now hung downward, with its fire almost extinguished, and sending out gasps of thick black smoke. The snake's head, however, which was the only one left now, was twice as fierce and venomous as ever before. It belched forth shoots of fire 500 yards long, and emitted hisses so loud, so harsh, and so ear-piercing that King Iobates heard them 50 miles off, and trembled till the throne shook under him. "Well-a-day," thought the poor king, "the chimera is certainly coming to devour me." Meanwhile, Pegasus had again paused in the air, and neighed angrily, while sparkles of a pure crystal flame darted out of his eyes. How unlike the lurid fire of the chimera! The aerial steed's spirit was all aroused, and so was that of Bellerophon. "Dost thou bleed, my immortal horse?" cried the young man, caring less for his own hurt than for the anguish of this glorious creature that ought never to have tasted pain. "The execrable chimera shall pay for this mischief with his last head." Then he shook the bridle, shouted loudly, and guided Pegasus, not aslantwise as before, but straight at the monster's hideous front. So rapid was the onset that it seemed but a dazzle and a flash before Bellerophon was at close grips with his enemy. The chimera, by this time, after losing its second head, had got into a red-hot passion of pain and rampant rage. It so flounced about, half on earth and partly in the air, that it was impossible to say which element it rested upon. It opened its snake jaws to such an abominable width that Pegasus might almost have flown right down its throat, wings outspread, rider and all. At their approach, it shot out a tremendous blast of its fiery breath, and enveloped Bellerophon and his steed in a perfect atmosphere of flame, singeing the wings of Pegasus, scorching off one whole side of the young man's golden ringlets, and making them both far hotter than was comfortable, from head to foot. But this was nothing to what followed. When the airy rush of the winged horse had brought him within the distance of 100 yards, the chimera gave a spring and flung its huge, awkward, venomous, and utterly detestable carcass right upon poor Pegasus, clung around him with might and main, and tied up in its snaky tail into a knot. Up flew the aerial steed, higher, higher, higher above the mountain peaks, above the clouds, and almost out of sight of the solid earth. But still the earth-born monster kept its hold, and was borne upward, along with the creature of light and air. Bellerophon, meanwhile, turning about, found himself face to face with the ugly grimness of the chimera's visage, and could only avoid being scorched to death, or bitten right in twain by holding up his shield. Over the upper edge of the shield, he looked sternly into the savage eyes of the monster. But the chimera was so mad with wild pain and grief that it did not guard itself so well as might else have been the case. Perhaps, after all, the best way to fight a chimera is by getting as close to it as you can. In its effort to stick its horrible iron claws into its enemy, the creature left its own breast quite exposed, and, perceiving this, Bellerophon thrust his sword up to the hilt into its cruel heart. Immediately the snaky tail untied its knot. The monster let go of its hold of Pegasus, and fell from that vast height downward, while the fire within its bosom, instead of being put out, burned fiercer than ever, and quickly began to consume the dead carcass. Thus it fell out of the sky, all aflame, and it being nightfall before it reached the earth, was mistaken for a shooting star or a comet. But at early sunrise, some cottagers were going for their day's labor, and saw, to their astonishment, that several acres of ground were strewn with black ashes. In the middle of a field, there was a heap of whitened bones, a great deal higher than a haystack. Nothing else was ever seen of the dreadful chimera. And when Bellerophon had won his victory, he bent forward and kissed Pegasus, while the tears stood in his eyes. "Back now, my beloved steed," said he. "Back to the fountain of Pirene." Pegasus skimmed through the air, quicker than ever he did before, and reached the fountain in a very short time. And there he found the old man leaning on his staff, and the country fellow watering his cow, and the pretty maiden filling her pitcher. "I remember now," quoth the old man, I saw this winged horse once before, when I was quite a lad, but he was 10 times handsomer in those days. I own a cart horse worth 3 of him, said the country fellow. If this pony were mine, the first thing I should do would be to clip his wings. But the poor maiden said nothing, for she had always the luck to be afraid at the wrong time. So she ran away and let her pitcher tumble down and broke it. "Where is the gentle child?" asked Bellerophon, "who used to keep me company and never lost his faith, and never was weary of gazing into the fountain?" "Here I am, dear Bellerophon," said the child softly. For the little boy had spent day after day on the margin of Pyrene, waiting for his friend to come back. But when he perceived Bellerophon descending through the clouds, mounted on the winged horse, he had shrunk back into the shrubbery. He was a delicate and tender child, and dreaded lest the old man and the country fellow should see the tears gushing from his eyes. "Thou hast won the victory," said he, joyfully, running to the knee of Bellerophon, who still sat on the back of Pegasus. "I knew thou wouldst." "Yes, dear child," replied Bellerophon, alighting from the winged horse. "But if thy faith had not helped me, I should never have waited for Pegasus, and never have gone up above the clouds, and never conquered the terrible Chimera. Thou, my beloved little friend, hast done it all. And now let us give Pegasus his liberty." So he slipped off the enchanted bridle from the head of the marvelous steed. "Be free forevermore, my Pegasus," cried he, with a shade of sadness in his tone. "Be as free as thou art fleet." But Pegasus rested his head on Bellerophon's shoulder, and would not be persuaded to take flight. "Well then," said Bellerophon, caressing the airy horse, "thou shalt be with me as long as thou wilt, and we will go together forthwith and tell King Iobates that the Chimera is destroyed." Then Bellerophon embraced the gentle child, and promised to come to him again, and departed. But, in after years, that child took higher flights upon the aerial steed than ever did Bellerophon, and achieved more honorable deeds than his friend's victory over the Chimera. For, gentle and tender as he was, he grew to be a mighty poet. Pegasus, the Winged Horse, by Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Perceval, from Bulfinch's Mythology, by Thomas Bulfinch. The father and 2 elder brothers of Perceval had fallen in battle or tournaments, and hence, as the last hope of his family, his mother retired with him into a solitary region, where he was brought up in total ignorance of arms and chivalry. He was allowed no weapon but a little Scots spear, which was the only thing of all her lord's fair gear that his mother carried to the wood with her. In the use of this he became so skilful that he could kill with it not only the animals of the chase for the table, but even birds on the wing. At length, however, Perceval was roused to a desire of military renown by seeing in the forest 5 knights who were in complete armour. He said to his mother, "Mother, what are those yonder?" "They are angels, my son," said she. "By my faith, I will go and become an angel with them." And Perceval went to the road and met them. "Tell me, good lad," said one of them, "sawest thou a knight pass this way either today or yesterday?" "I know not," said he, "what a knight is." "Such a one as I am," said the knight. "If thou wilt tell me what I ask thee, I will tell thee what thou asketh me." "Gladly I will do so," said Sir Owain, for that was the knight's name. "What is this?" demanded Perceval, touching the saddle. "It is a saddle," said Sir Owain. Then he asked about all the accoutrements which he saw upon the men and the horses, and about the arms, and what they were for, and how they were used. And Sir Owain showed him all those things fully, and Perceval in return gave him such information as he had. Then Perceval returned to his mother and said to her, "Mother, those were not angels, but honourable knights." Then his mother swooned away. And Perceval went to the place where they kept the horses that carried firewood and provisions for the castle, and he took a bony piebald horse, which seemed to him the strongest of them, and he pressed the pack into the form of a saddle, and with twisted twigs he imitated the trappings which he had seen upon the horses. When he came again to his mother, the countess had recovered from her swoon. "My son," said she, "desirest thou to ride forth?" "Yes, with thy leave," said he. "Go forward then," she said, "to the court of Arthur, where there are the best and the noblest and the most bountiful of men, and tell him thou art Perceval, the son of Pellinore, and ask of him to bestow knighthood on thee. And whenever thou seest a church, repeat there thy paternoster. And if thou see meat and drink, and hast need of them, thou mayest take them. If thou hear an outcry of one in distress, proceed toward it, especially if it be the cry of a woman, and render her what service thou canst. If thou see a fair jewel, win it, for thus shalt thou acquire fame. Yet freely give it to another, for thus thou shalt obtain praise. If thou see a fair woman, pay court to her, for thus thou wilt obtain love." After this discourse Perceval mounted the horse, and taking a number of sharp-pointed sticks in his hand, he rode forth. And he rode far in the woody wilderness, without food or drink. At last he came to an opening in the wood, where he saw a tent, and as he thought it might be a church, he said his paternoster to it. And he went towards it, and the door of the tent was open, and Perceval dismounted and entered the tent. In the tent he found a maiden sitting, with a golden frontlet on her forehead, and a gold ring on her hand. And Perceval said, "Maiden, I salute you, for my mother told me whenever I met a lady I must respectfully salute her." Perceiving in one corner of the tent some food, 2 flasks full of wine, and some boar's flesh roasted, he said, "My mother told me whenever I saw meat and drink to take it," and he ate greedily, for he was very hungry. The maiden said, "Sir, thou hadst best go quickly from here, for fear that my friends should come, and evil should befall you." But Perceval said, "My mother told me wheresoever I saw a fair jewel to take it," and he took the gold ring from her finger, and put it on his own, and he gave the maiden his own ring in exchange for hers. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. Perceval journeyed on till he arrived at Arthur's court, and it so happened that just at that time an uncourteous knight had offered Queen Guinevere a gross insult. For when her page was serving the queen with a golden goblet, this knight struck the arm of the page and dashed the wine in the queen's face and over her stomacher. Then he said, "If any have boldness to avenge this insult to Guinevere, let him follow me to the meadow." So the knight took his horse and rode to the meadow, carrying away the golden goblet. And all the household hung down their heads, and no one offered to follow the knight to take vengeance upon him, for it seemed to them that no one could have ventured on so daring an outrage unless he possessed such powers through magic or charms that none could be able to punish him. Just then, behold, Perceval entered the hall upon the bony piebald horse, with his uncouth trappings. In the centre of the hall stood Kay, the seneschal. "Tell me, tall man," said Perceval, "is that Arthur yonder?" "What wouldst thou with Arthur?" asked Kay. "My mother told me to go to Arthur, and receive knighthood from him." "By my faith," said he, "thou art all too meanly equipped with horse and with arms." Then all the household began to jeer and laugh at him. But there was a certain damsel who had been a whole year at Arthur's court, and had never been known to smile. And the king's fool had said that this damsel would not smile till she had seen him who would be the flower of chivalry. Now this damsel came up to Perceval and told him, smiling, that if he lived he would be one of the bravest and best of knights. "Truly," said Kay, "thou art ill taught to remain a year at Arthur's court, with choice of society, and smile on no one, and now before the face of Arthur and all his knights to call such a man as this the flower of knighthood." And he gave her a box on the ear, that she fell senseless to the ground. Then said Kay to Perceval, "Go after the knight who went hence to the meadow, overthrow him, and recover the golden goblet, and possess thyself of his horse and arms, and thou shalt have knighthood." I will do so, tall man, said Perceval. So he turned his horse's head toward the meadow, and when he came there the knight was riding up and down, proud of his strength and valour and noble mien. Tell me, said the knight, didst thou see any one coming after me from the court? The tall man that was there, said Perceval, told me to come and overthrow thee, and to take from thee the goblet and thy horse and armour for myself. Silence, said the knight. Go back to the court, and tell Arthur either to come himself, or to send some other to fight with me, and unless he do so quickly, I will not wait for him. By my faith, said Perceval, choose thou whether it shall be willingly or unwillingly, for I will have the horse and the arms and the goblet. Upon this the knight ran at him furiously, and struck him a violent blow with the shaft of his spear, between the neck and the shoulder. Ha, ha, lad, said Perceval, my mother's servants were not used to play with me in this wise, so thus will I play with thee. And he threw at him one of the sharp-pointed sticks, and it struck him in the eye, and came out the back of his head, so that he fell down lifeless. Verily, said Sir Owain, the son of Urien, to Kay the seneschal, thou wast ill-advised to send that madman after the knight, for he must either be overthrown or flee, and either way it will be a disgrace to Arthur and his warriors. Therefore will I go to see what has befallen him. So Sir Owain went to the meadow, and he found Perceval trying in vain to get the dead knight's armour off, in order to clothe himself with it. Sir Owain unfastened the armour, and helped Perceval to put it on, and taught him how to put his foot in the stirrup, and use the spur, for Perceval had never used stirrup nor spur, but rode without saddle, and urged on his horse with a stick. Then Owain would have had him return to the court, to receive the praise that was his due, but Perceval said, I will not come to the court till I have encountered the tall man that is there, to revenge the injury he did to the maiden. But take thou the goblet to Queen Guinevere, and tell King Arthur that, wherever I am, I will be his vassal, and will do him what profit and service I can. And Sir Owain went back to the court, and related all these things to Arthur and Guinevere, and to all the household. And Perceval rode forward, and he came to a lake, on the side of which was a fair castle, and on the border of the lake he saw a hoary-headed man sitting upon a velvet cushion, and his attendants were fishing in the lake. When the hoary-headed man beheld Perceval approaching, he arose and went into the castle. Perceval rode to the castle, and the door was open, and he entered the hall. And the hoary-headed man received Perceval courteously, and asked him to sit by him on the cushion. When it was time, the tables were set, and they went to meat. And when they had finished their meat, the hoary-headed man asked Perceval if he knew how to fight with the sword. I know not, said Perceval, but were I to be taught, doubtless I should. And the hoary-headed man said to him, I am thy uncle, thy mother's brother. I am called King Pecheur. Thou shalt remain with me a space, in order to learn the manners and customs of different countries, and courtesy and noble bearing. And this do thou remember, if thou seest aught to cause thy wonder, ask not the meaning of it. If no one has the courtesy to inform thee, the reproach will not fall upon thee, but upon me that am thy teacher. While Perceval and his uncle discoursed together, Perceval beheld two youths enter the hall bearing a golden cup and a spear of mighty size, with blood dripping from its point to the ground. And when all the company saw this, they began to weep and lament. But for all that, the man did not break off his discourse with Perceval, and as he did not tell him the meaning of what he saw, he forbare to ask him concerning it. Now the cup that Perceval saw was the Sangreal, and the spear the sacred spear, and afterwards King Pecheur removed with those sacred relics into a far country. One evening Perceval entered a valley, and came to a hermit's cell, and the hermit welcomed him gladly, and there he spent the night. And in the morning he arose, and when he went forth, behold, a shower of snow had fallen in the night, and a hawk had killed a wild fowl in front of the cell. And the noise of the horse had scared the hawk away, and a raven alighted on the bird. And Perceval stood and compared the blackness of the raven, and the whiteness of the snow, and the redness of the blood, to the hair of the lady that best he loved, which was blacker than jet, and to her skin, which was whiter than the snow, and to the two red spots upon her cheeks, which were redder than the blood upon the snow. Now Arthur and his household were in search of Perceval, and by chance they came that way. Know ye, said Arthur, who is the knight with the long spear that stands by the brook up yonder? Lord, said one of them, I will go and learn who he is. So the youth came to the place where Perceval was, and asked him what he did thus, and who he was. But Perceval was so intent upon his thought that he gave him no answer, and the youth thrust at Perceval with his lance, and Perceval turned upon him and struck him to the ground. And when the youth returned to the king and told how rudely he had been treated, Sir Kay said, I will go myself. And when he greeted Perceval and got no answer, he spoke to him rudely and angrily. And Perceval thrust at him with his lance and cast him down so that he broke his arm and his shoulder blade. And while he lay thus stunned, his horse returned back at a wild and prancing pace. Then said Sir Gawain, surnamed the Golden Tongue, because he was the most courteous knight in Arthur's court, It is not fitting that any should disturb an honourable knight from his thought unadvisedly, for either he is pondering some damage that he has sustained, or he is thinking of the lady whom best he loves. If it seem well to thee, lord, I will go and see if this knight has changed from his thought, and if he has, I will ask him courteously to come and visit thee. And Perceval was resting on the shaft of his spear, pondering the same thought, and Sir Gawain came to him and said, If I thought it would be as agreeable to thee as it would be to me, I would converse with thee. I have also a message from Arthur unto thee, to pray thee to come and visit him. And the 2 men before have been on this errand. That is true, said Perceval, and uncourteously they came. They attacked me, and I was annoyed thereat. Then he told him the thought that occupied his mind, and Gawain said, This was not an ungentle thought, and I should marvel if it were pleasant for thee to be drawn from it. Then said Perceval, Tell me, is Sir Kay in Arthur's court? He is, said Gawain, and truly he is the knight who fought with thee last. Verily, said Perceval, I am not sorry to have thus avenged the insult to the smiling maiden. Then Perceval told him his name, and said, Who art thou? And he replied, I am Gawain. I am right glad to meet thee, said Perceval, for I have everywhere heard of thy prowess and uprightness, and I solicit thy friendship. Thou shalt have it, by my faith, and grant me thine, said he. Gladly will I do so, answered Perceval. So they went together to Arthur, and saluted him. Behold, lord, said Gawain, him who thou hast sought so long. Welcome unto thee, chieftain, said Arthur. And hereupon there came the queen and her handmaidens, and Perceval saluted them. And they were rejoiced to see him, and bade him welcome. And Arthur did him great honour and respect, and they returned towards Caerleon. End of Perceval, from Bulfinch's Mythology by Thomas Bulfinch.
How Thor Got the Hammer by Louise Smythe. Sif was Thor's wife. Sif had long golden hair. Thor was very proud of Sif's golden hair. Thor was always going on long journeys. One day he went off and left Sif alone. She went out on the porch and fell asleep. Loki came along. He was always playing tricks. He saw Sif lying asleep. He said, I am going to cut off her hair. So Loki went up on the porch and cut off Sif's golden hair. When Sif woke up and saw that her hair was gone, she cried and cried. Then she ran to hide. She did not want Thor to see her. When Thor came home, he could not find Sif. Sif, Sif, he called, where are you? But Sif did not answer. Thor looked all around the house. At last he found her crying. Oh, Thor, look, all my hair is gone. Somebody has cut it off. It was a man. He ran away with it. Then Thor was very angry. He said, I know it was Loki. He is always getting into mischief. Just wait until I get him. And Thor went out to find Loki. Pretty soon he found him. Thor said, "Did you cut off Sif's hair?" Loki said, "Yes, I did." "Then you must pay for cutting off my wife's hair," said Thor. "All right," said Loki. "I will get you something better than the hair." Loki went down into the ground to the home of the dwarfs. It was very dark down there. The only light came from the dwarfs' fires. The dwarves were ugly little black men. They were not any bigger than your thumb. They had crooked backs and crooked legs. Their eyes looked like black beads. Loki said, "Can you make me a gold crown that will grow like real hair?" The dwarves said, "Yes, we can." So the busy little dwarves worked all night. When the morning came, the dwarves gave Loki his crown of golden hair. They gave him a spear and a ship, too. Loki took the things up to Asgard where the gods all lived. Then the gods all came up to him. He showed them the things. The gods said, "They are very wonderful." And Loki said, "Oh, nobody else can make such things as my little dwarfs." A little dwarf named Brock was standing nearby. He heard Loki say that. Then he stepped up and said, "My brother can make just as good things as these." Loki laughed and said, "If you can get 3 things as wonderful as these, I'll give you my head." Brock went down into the ground where his little dwarves were working. Brock's brother was named Sindri. He said to his brother, "Loki says that you can't make such nice things as his dwarves can. He said that he would give me his head if I could get him such wonderful things as his." This made the dwarves angry. Their eyes grew big. They said, "He will see what we can do." Sindri wanted to know what the wonderful things were. Brock said, "Loki has a golden crown that will grow like real hair, a ship that can go anywhere, and a spear that never misses the mark." "We will show him," said the dwarves. The dwarves soon had the fires burning. Then Sindri put a pigskin into the fire. He gave the bellows to Brock and said, "Now blow as hard as you can." Then Sindri went out. Brock blew and blew. A little fly came in and bit him on the hand. The fly bit him so hard that Brock thought he would have to stop blowing, but he did not. Then Sindri came back. He took out a golden pig from the fire. He put a lump of gold into the fire. He said to Brock, "Blow and blow and do not stop." Then Sindri went out again. So Brock blew as hard as he could. Then the same fly came in and bit him again. Brock thought that he could not stand it, but he kept on. When Sindri came back, he took a gold ring from the fire. Then Sindri put a lump of iron into the fire. He said to Brock, "Now blow as hard as you can." And Sindri went out. Brock blew and blew. The same mean fly came again and bit him on the forehead. It bit so hard that blood ran into his eyes. Brock put up his hand to brush away the fly. Just then Sindri came back. He took the hammer out of the fire. "There," he said, "you have almost spoiled it. The handle is too short, but it cannot be helped now." Brock hurried up to Asgard with his things. All the gods came around to see. Then Loki came up to show his things. He put the crown of gold on Sif's head and it began to grow like real hair. He gave the spear to Odin and said, "This spear will never miss its mark." Then he took out the ship. He said, "This is a wonderful ship. It will sail on any sea, and yet you can fold it up and put it into your pocket." Loki felt proud. for he thought his things were the best. All the gods felt very sorry for little Brock. They thought Loki's things were fine. They were afraid Brock's would not be so nice. They said, "Now, Brock, show your things." Brock took out the gold ring. He said, "Each night this ring will throw off a ring just like it." He gave the ring to Odin. Then Brock took out the golden pig. He said, "This pig can go anywhere, on the ground or in the air. It can go faster than any horse. If the night is dark, the shining pig will make it light." Then Brock showed the hammer. He said, "This is not a very pretty hammer. When I was making it, Loki turned himself into a fly and made me spoil it. The fly bit me so hard that I had to stop blowing, so the handle is a little short, but it is a wonderful hammer. If you throw it at anything, it will hit the mark and come back to you." The gods picked up the hammer and passed it around. They said, "It will be just the things with which to keep the frost giants out of Asgard." The gods said, "Brock's things are the best." Brock gave the hammer to Thor. That is the way Thor got his wonderful hammer. Then Brock said to Loki, "You said I could have your head if my things were the best." Loki was angry and said, "Yes, I told you that you could have my head, but you can't touch my neck." Of course, Brock could not get his head without touching his neck. So Brock did not get Loki's head. End of How Thor Got the Hammer by Louise Smythe. The Hammer Lost and Found by Louise Smythe. The frost giants did not like the sunshine. They did not like to see the flowers. They did not like to hear the birds sing. They wanted to spoil everything. The frost giants wanted to get into Asgard, but they didn't know how. They were afraid of Thor and his hammer. They said, "If only we can get the hammer, we can get into Asgard." They talked and planned all night. At last one frost giant said, "I know how we can get the hammer. I will dress in a bird suit. Then I will fly up to Thor's house and get the hammer." The next night the frost giant flew into the house while Thor was asleep. He took the hammer and flew away with it. When Thor woke, he put out his hand to get the hammer. It was gone. He said, "Loki, the hammer is gone. The frost giants have taken it. We must get it back." Loki said, "I can get it back, if Freya will let me have her falcon suit." So he went to Freya and said, "Will you let me have your falcon suit? I can get the hammer back if you will." Freya said, "Yes, of course I will. If I had a gold suit, you could have it. Anything to get the hammer back." Loki took the falcon suit and put it on. He flew over the city. All the people saw him flying. They said, "What a strange bird." They did not know that it was Loki going for the hammer. When Loki came to the city of the frost giants, he took off the falcon suit. He walked and walked until he came to Thrym's house. Thrym was the giant who took the hammer. Thrym was sitting on the porch making gold collars for his dogs. When he saw Loki, he said, "What do you want?" Loki said, "I have come for the hammer." The old giant laughed and said, "You will never get that hammer. It is buried 8 miles deep in the ground. But there is one way you can get it. I will give you the hammer if you get Freya for my wife." So Loki went back to Asgard. Thor said, "Well, did you get the hammer?" "No, but we can get it if Freya will be Thrym's wife." Then they went to Freya's house. They said, "Put on your very best clothes and come with us. You must be Thrym's wife." Freya said, "Do you think I will be the frost giant's wife? I won't be his wife. Thor said, we can get the hammer back if you will. But Freya said, no, I will not be his wife. Loki said, you will have to, if we get the hammer back. Still Freya said, I will not go, and she was very angry. She shook so hard that she broke her necklace, and it fell to the floor. Then the god said, Thor, you must dress like Freya. You will have to play you are the bride. Thor said, I won't do it. You will all laugh at me. I won't dress up like a girl. They said, well, that is the only way we can get the hammer back. Thor said, I do not like to dress like a girl, but I will do it. Then they dressed Thor up like Freya. They put on Freya's dress, necklace, and veil, and braided his hair. Loki said, I will dress up too and be your servant. They got into Thor's goat wagon and went into the giant's home. When the frost giant saw them coming, they said, get ready, here comes the bride. We will sit down to the table as soon as they come. The dinner was ready on time. The table was full of good things. All sat down. The bride ate a whole ox and 8 salmon before the others had a bite. She must be very hungry, the frost giant said. Yes, Loki said, she was so glad to come. She hasn't eaten anything for 8 days. Then they brought up the mead. The bride drank 3 barrels of mead. How thirsty she is, said the frost giants. Loki said, yes, she is very thirsty. She was so glad to come. She did not drink anything for 8 days. Old Thrym said, I had everything I wanted but Freya. Now I have Freya. And Thrym went to kiss the bride. He lifted her veil, but her eyes shone like fire. Thrym stepped back. He said, what makes Freya's eyes shine so? Loki said, oh, she was so glad to come she did not sleep for 8 nights. Then Loki said, it is time for the hammer. Go and get it and put it in the bride's lap. As soon as the hammer was in his lap, Thor tore off the veil. He took the hammer and whirled it around. Fire flew from it. The fire burned the house and the frost giants ran away. So Thor got his hammer back. The following stories by Miss Smythe were originally published under the title of The Golden Fleece. They have been carefully revised and illustrated for this book. End of The Hammer Lost and Found by Louise Smythe.
The 3 Chests by Parker Fillmore. The 3 Chests, the story of the wicked old man of the sea. There was once an honest old farmer who had 3 daughters. His farm ran down to the shores of a deep lake. One day, as he leaned over the water to take a drink, wicked old Westervelt reached up from the bottom of the lake and clutched him by the beard. Ouch! Ouch! The farmer cried. Let me go! Westervelt only held on more tightly. Yes, I'll let you go, he said, but only on this condition, that you give me one of your daughters for wife. Give you one of my daughters? Never! Very well, then I'll never let go. Wicked old Westervelt declared, and with that he began jerking at the beard, as if it were a bell rope. Wait, wait, the farmer spluttered. Now, he didn't want to give one of his daughters to wicked old Westervelt, of course not. But at the same time, he was in Westervelt's power, and he realized that if he didn't do what the old reprobate demanded, he might lose his life, and so leave all 3 of his daughters orphans. Perhaps, for the good of all, he had better sacrifice one of them. All right, he said, let me go, and I'll send you my oldest daughter, I promise. So Westervelt let go his beard, and the farmer scrambled to his feet and hurried home. My dear, he said to the oldest daughter, I left a bit of the harness down at the lake. Like a good girl, would you run down and get it for me? The eldest daughter went at once, and when she reached the water's edge, old Westervelt reached up and caught her about the waist and carried her down to the bottom of the lake where he lived in a big house. At first he was kind to her. He made her mistress of the house and gave her the keys to all the rooms and closets. He went very carefully over the keys, and pointing to one, he said, That key you must never use, for it opens the door to a room which I forbid you to enter. The eldest daughter began keeping house for old Wettahinen and spent her time cooking and cleaning and spinning much as she used to at home with her father. The days went by, and she grew familiar with the house and began to know what was in every room and every closet. At first, she felt no temptation to open the forbidden door. If old Wettahinen wanted to have a secret room, well and good. But why in the world had he given her the key if he really didn't want her to open the door? The more she thought about it, the more she wondered. Every time she passed the room, she stopped a moment and stared at the door. It looked just exactly like the doors that led into all the other rooms. I wonder why he doesn't want me to open just that door, she kept asking herself. Finally, one day, when old Wettahinen was away, she thought, I don't believe it would matter if I opened that door just a little crack and peeped in once. No one would know the difference. For a few moments she hesitated, then mustered up courage enough to turn the key in the forbidden lock and throw open the door. The room was a storeroom, with boxes and chests and old jars piled up around the wall. This was unexciting enough, but in the middle of the floor was something that made her start when she saw what it was. It was blood. That's what it was, a pool of dark red blood. She was about to slam the door shut when she saw something else that made her pause. This was a lovely shining ring that lay in the midst of the pool. Oh, she thought to herself, what a beautiful ring. If I had it, I'd wear it on my finger. The longer she looked at it, the more she wanted it. If I'm very careful, she said, I know I could reach over and pick it up without touching the blood. She tiptoed cautiously into the room, wrapped her skirts tightly about her legs, knelt down on the floor, and stretched her arm over the pool. She picked up the ring very carefully, but even so, she got a few drops of blood on her fingers. No matter, she thought, I can wash that off and see the lovely ring. But later, after she had the door again locked, when she tried to wash the blood off, she found that she couldn't. She tried soap, she tried sand, she tried everything she could think of, but without success. I don't care, she thought to herself. If Wettahinen sees the blood, I'll just tell him I cut my finger by accident. So when Wettahinen came home, she hid the ring and pretended nothing was the matter. After supper, Wettahinen put his head on her lap and said, Now, my dear, scratch my head and make me drowsy for bed. She began scratching his head as she had many nights before, but at the first touch of her fingers he cried out, Stop! You're burning my ear. There must be some blood on your fingers. Let me see. He reached up and caught her hand, and when he saw the blood stains, he flew into a towering rage. I thought so. You've been in the forbidden room. He jumped up, and without allowing her time to say a word, he just cut off her head then and there with no more concern than if she had been a mosquito. After that, he took the body and severed head and threw them into the forbidden room and locked the door. Now then, he growled, she won't disobey me again. This was all very well, but now he had no one to keep house for him and cook and scratch his head in the evening, and soon he decided he'd have to get another wife. He remembered that the farmer had 2 more daughters, so he thought to himself that now he'd marry the second sister. He waited his chance, and one day, when the farmer was out in his boat fishing, old Wettahinen came up from the bottom of the lake and clutched the boat. When the poor farmer tried to row back to shore, he couldn't make the boat move an inch. He worked and worked at the oars, and wicked old Wettahinen let him struggle until he was exhausted. Then he put his head up out of the water and over the side of the boat, as though nothing were the matter, and said, Hello. Oh, the farmer cried, wishing he were safe on shore. It's you, is it? I wondered what was holding my boat. Yes, wicked old Wettahinen said, it's me, and I'm going to hold your boat right here on this spot until you promise to give me another of your daughters. What could the farmer do? He pleaded with Wettahinen, but Wettahinen was firm, and the upshot was that before the farmer again walked dry land, he had promised Wettahinen his second daughter. Well, when he got home, he pretended he had forgotten his axe in the boat, and sent his second daughter down to the lake to get it. Wicked old Wettahinen caught her as he had caught her sister, and carried her home with him to his house at the bottom of the lake. Wettahinen treated the second sister just exactly as he had the first, making her mistress of the house and telling her she might use every key but one. Like her sister, she, too, after a time, gave way to temptation of looking into the forbidden room, and when she saw the shining ring lying in the pool of blood, of course she wanted it, and of course, when she reached to get it, she dabbled her fingers in the blood. So that was the end of her, too, for wicked old Wettahinen, when he saw the blood stains, just cut her head right off and threw her body and the severed head into the forbidden room beside the body and head of her sister and locked the door. Time went by, and the farmer was living happily with his youngest daughter, when one day when he was out chopping wood, he found a pair of fine birch bark brogues. He put them on and instantly found himself walking away from the woods and down to the lake. He tried to stop, but he couldn't. He tried to walk in another direction, but the brogues carried him straight down to the water's edge and out into the lake until he was in waist deep. Then he heard a gruff voice saying, "Hello there, what are you doing with my brogues?" Of course, it was wicked old Westervelt who had played that trick to get the farmer into his power again. "What do you want this time?" the poor farmer cried. "I want your youngest daughter," Westervelt said. "What, my youngest daughter?" "Yes." "I won't give her up," the farmer declared. "I don't care what you do to me, I won't give her up." "Oh, very well," Westervelt said, and immediately the brogues, which had been standing still while they talked, started walking again. They carried the farmer out into the lake farther and farther, until the water was up to his chin. Wait a minute," he cried. The brogues stopped walking, and Westervelt said, "Well, do you promise to give her to me?" "No," the farmer began. "She's my last daughter, and—" Before he could say more, the brogues walked on, and the water rose to his nose. In desperation, he threw up his hands and shouted, "I promise! I promise!" So when he got home that day, he said to his youngest daughter, whose name was Lisa, "Lisa, my dear, I forgot my brogues at the lake. Like a good girl, won't you run and get them for me?" So Lisa went to the lake, and Westervelt, of course, caught her and carried her down to his house as he had her two sisters. Then the same old story was repeated. Westervelt made Lisa mistress of the house and gave her keys to all the doors and closets, with the same prohibition against opening the door of the forbidden room. "If I am mistress of the house," Lisa said to herself, "why should I not unlock every door?" She waited until one day when Westervelt was away from home, then went boldly to the forbidden room, fitted the key in the lock, and flung open the door. There lay her two poor sisters with their heads cut off. There in the pool of blood sparkled the lovely ring, but Lisa paid no heed to it. "Wicked old Westervelt," Lisa cried. "I suppose he thinks that ring will tempt me, but nothing will tempt me to touch that awful blood." Then she rummaged about, opening boxes and chests and turning things over. In a dark corner she found two pitchers, one marked Water of Life, the other Water of Death. "Ha! This is what I want," she cried, taking the pitcher of the Water of Life. She set the severed heads of her sisters in place, and then with the magic water brought them back to life. She used up all the Water of Life, so she filled the pitcher marked Water of Life with the water from the other pitcher, the Water of Death. She hid her sisters each in a big wooden chest. She shut and locked the door of the forbidden room, and Westervelt, when he came home, found her working at her spinning wheel as though nothing unusual had happened. After supper, Westervelt said, "Now scratch my head and make me drowsy for bed." So Lisa scratched his wicked old head, and she did it so well that he grunted with satisfaction. Ah, he said, "that's good. Now just behind my right ear. Oh, that's it. You're a good girl, you are. You're not like some of them who do what they're told not to do. Now behind the other ear. Oh, that's fine. Yes, you're a good girl, and if there's anything you want me to do, just tell me what it is." "I want you to send a chest of things to my poor old father," Lisa said. "Just a lot of little nothings, odds and ends that I've picked up about the house. I'd be ashamed to have you open the chest and see them. I do wish you'd carry the chest ashore tomorrow and leave it where my father will find it." "All right, I will," Westervelt promised. He was true to his word. The next morning he hoisted one of the chests on his shoulder, the one that had in it the eldest sister. He trudged off with it and tossed it up on shore at a place where he was sure the farmer would find it. Lisa then wheedled him into carrying the second chest that had in it the second sister. This time Westervelt wasn't so good-natured. "I don't know what she can always be sending her father," he grumbled. "If she sends another chest, I'll have to look inside and see." Now Lisa, when the second sister was safely delivered, began to plan her own escape. She pulled out another empty chest, and then one evening, after she had succeeded in making old Westervelt comfortable and drowsy, she begged him to carry this also to her father. He grumbled and protested, but finally promised. "And you won't look inside, will you? Promise me you won't," Lisa begged. Westervelt said he wouldn't, but he intended to just the same. Well, the next morning, as soon as Westervelt went out, Lisa took the churn and dressed it up in some of her own clothes. She carried it to the top of the house and perched it on the ridge of the roof before a spinning wheel. Then she herself crept inside the third chest and waited. When Westervelt came home, he looked up and saw what he thought was Lisa spinning on the roof. "Hello," he shouted. "What are you doing up there?" Lisa in the chest answered in a voice that sounded as if it came from the roof. "I'm spinning. And you, Wettahinen, my dear, don't forget the chest you promised to carry to my poor old father. It's standing in the kitchen." Wettahinen grumbled, but because of his promise, he hoisted the chest on his shoulder and started off. When he'd gone a little way, he thought to put it down and take a peep inside. Instantly, Lisa's voice, sounding as if it came from the roof, cried out, "No, no, you promised not to look inside." "I'm not looking inside," Wettahinen called back. "I'm only resting a minute." Then he thought to himself, "I suppose she's sitting up there so she can watch me." When he'd gone some distance farther, he thought again to set the chest down and open the lid, but instantly Lisa's voice, as from a long way off, called out, "No, no, you promised not to look inside." "Who's looking inside?" he called back, pretending he was only resting. Every time he thought it would be safe to put down the chest and open the lid, Lisa's voice cried out, "No, no, you promised not to." "Mercy on us," old Wettahinen fumed to himself. Who would have thought she could see so far? On the shore of the lake, when he threw down the chest in disgust, he tried one last time to raise the lid. Instantly Lisa's voice cried out, "No, no, you promised not to." "I'm not looking inside," Wettahinen roared, and in a fury he left the chest and started back into the water. All the way home he grumbled and growled. "Nice way to treat a man, always making him carry chests. I won't carry another one, no matter how much she begs me." When he came near home, he saw the spinning wheel still on the roof and the figure still seated before it. "Why haven't you got my dinner ready?" he called out angrily. The figure at the spinning wheel made no answer. "What's the matter with you?" Wettahinen cried. "Why are you sitting there like a wooden image instead of cooking my dinner?" Still the figure made no answer, and in a rage Wettahinen began climbing the roof. He reached out blindly, clutched at Lisa's skirt, and jerked it so hard that the churn came clattering down on his head. It knocked him off the roof, and he fell all the way to the ground and cracked his wicked old head wide open. "Ouch! Ouch!" he roared in pain. "Just wait till I get hold of that Lisa." He crawled to the forbidden room and poured over himself the water that was in the pitcher marked water of life. But it wasn't the water of life at all. It was the water of death, and so it didn't help his wicked old cracked head at all. In fact, it just made it worse and worse. Lisa and her sisters were never again troubled by him, nor was anyone else that lived on the shores of that lake. "Wonder what's become of wicked old Wettahinen," people began saying. Lisa thought she knew, but she didn't tell. End of The Three Chests by Parker Fillmore.